A mountain man everyone feared walked into a crowded saloon and said 5 words that made the entire room explode with laughter. "I need a wife by morning." But when a quiet widow stood up and asked him one simple question, the laughter died instantly, and what happened next would become the most powerful legend the frontier had ever known. This is the story of two broken people who chose kindness when the world chose cruelty, and how that single choice changed everything. Stay with me until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Wyoming Territory in 1874 didn't forgive weakness. It didn't forgive mistakes. And it sure as hell didn't forgive loneliness. Gideon Rourke understood that better than most men. For 19 years, he'd lived alone in a timber cabin so deep in the mountains above Red Hollow that most folks forgot he existed until they needed something killed or tracked. He was the kind of man children whispered about when the wind howled through the pines, the kind mothers warned their daughters to avoid, the kind even hardened prospectors crossed the street to dodge. At 6'5", Gideon moved through the world like a force of nature, silent, inevitable, and utterly indifferent to what people thought. His face carried the topography of violence, a jagged scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw, a nose that had been broken so many times it sat crooked, and eyes the color of January ice that never seemed to focus on anything for long. His hands were massive, scarred across the knuckles, permanently stained dark from years of skinning pelts and building fires in sub-zero cold. He spoke to storms more than people. To his horse, a temperamental bay mare named Rust, more than neighbors. To the mountains themselves more than to any living soul in Red Hollow. Most people assumed Gideon preferred it that way. They were wrong. But Gideon had stopped trying to explain himself years ago, somewhere around the time he realized his presence made women clutch their children closer and men reach instinctively for weapons they weren't even carrying. He'd learned to live with the fear in their eyes, learned to accept that his size, his scars, his silence all added up to something people wanted nothing to do with. So he stayed in the mountains, trapped beaver and marten, hunted elk when supplies ran low, survived. That was February. By March, everything had changed. It started with the storm, one of those late winter monsters that rolled down from the high country without warning, turning the world into a howling white void. Gideon had been checking his trap lines along the eastern ridge when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. He knew better than to push his luck. He turned Russ toward home and let the mare pick her way through drifts that were already knee-deep and rising fast. That's when he saw the wagon. It sat tilted against a pine tree just off the main trail, half buried in snow that hadn't been there that morning. The canvas cover had torn loose and flapped uselessly in the wind. One wheel was shattered. The 2 mules that should have been in the harness were gone. Run off or dead, Gideon couldn't tell which. He almost rode past. Almost. But something made him stop. Some instinct deeper than logic. He swung down from Rust and approached the wagon carefully, one hand on the knife at his belt. "Anyone alive in there?" No answer. Just the wind screaming through the trees. Gideon pulled back the torn canvas and looked inside. 2 children stared back at him. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, sat in the corner with his arms wrapped around a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4. Both were shivering so hard their teeth chattered. Their lips had gone blue. Their faces were hollow with hunger and fear. Between them, wrapped in a blanket that had frozen stiff, lay 2 adults, a man and a woman. Parents, Gideon assumed. Both were dead, had been for at least a day, maybe 2. Fever, from the look of them. The kind that swept through wagon trains and killed entire families before anyone realized what was happening. The boy looked at Gideon with eyes that had already seen too much. "They told us to stay in the wagon," the boy whispered. "They said someone would come." Gideon stood there in the screaming wind, staring at 2 children who would be dead by morning if he left them, and felt something crack open inside his chest that he'd kept sealed for nearly 2 decades. "Come on," he said roughly. "Both of you, now." The boy didn't move. Mama said, "Your mama's gone." Gideon's voice came out harsher than he intended. He tried again, softer. "I'm sorry, boy, but she's gone. And this storm's going to kill you if you stay here. You understand?" The girl started crying, a thin, hopeless sound that cut through the wind. The boy's face hardened. He was too young to look that old. Where are you taking us? My cabin, 3 miles west. You can walk that far? I can carry Emma. No, you can't. I'll carry her. You stay close to my horse. Gideon reached into the wagon and the boy immediately shifted to block him, one skinny arm thrown protectively across his sister. The gesture was so fierce, so completely useless against someone Gideon's size, that it stopped him cold. Easy, Gideon said quietly. I'm not going to hurt either of you. I give you my word. We don't know you. That's true. But you know that storm. And you know what happens to people who stay out in it. Gideon met the boy's eyes steadily. I'm offering you a chance. That's all. You can take it or leave it, but decide fast because we're losing light. The boy looked at his sister, at his dead parents, at the storm that was burying everything in white. Okay, he whispered. Gideon lifted the girl, Emma, out of the wagon as gently as his scarred hands could manage. She weighed almost nothing. He wrapped her in his own bearskin coat and settled her against his chest, then turned to the boy. What's your name? Caleb? All right, Caleb. You hold on to Rust's saddle and don't let go for anything. She'll get us home. The journey back nearly killed them all. The storm had erased the trail completely. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet. The temperature kept falling. Gideon navigated by memory and instinct, trusting Rust to find the path when he couldn't. Emma had stopped shivering, a bad sign. Caleb stumbled repeatedly, but never made a sound, never complained, just kept gripping that saddle like his life depended on it, which it did. By the time they reached the cabin, full dark had fallen, and the storm was at its worst. Gideon kicked the door open, carried Emma inside, and shouted at Caleb to follow. He dumped more wood on the fire than was smart, stoked it until the flames roared, then stripped the wet clothes off both children and wrapped them in every blanket and fur he owned. Emma's eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow. Is she dying? Caleb asked. His voice didn't shake. It should have. No. Gideon hoped he wasn't lying. But she's cold. Real cold. We need to warm her up slow. He heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth, tucked them around Emma's small body. Made Caleb drink hot water even though the boy insisted he wasn't thirsty. Kept the fire burning so hot that sweat ran down his own back. Slowly, painfully slowly, color returned to Emma's face. She opened her eyes somewhere around midnight and immediately started crying for her mother. Gideon had no idea what to say. No experience with grief, with children, with any of this. He just sat there like a useless piece of furniture while Caleb held his sister and whispered things Gideon couldn't hear. Eventually, Emma cried herself back to sleep. Caleb looked up at Gideon with eyes that were far too old for his face. What happens to us now? You stay here until the storm breaks. Then we'll figure it out. And after that? Gideon didn't have an answer. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Gideon learned things about himself he'd never suspected. Like the fact that he could cook something other than venison and beans when 2 hungry children were involved. Like the fact that he remembered a lullaby his own mother had sung, though he would have sworn he'd forgotten everything about her. Like the fact that watching Emma smile for the first time, a tiny, uncertain thing when she saw a squirrel through the window, could make his chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with injury. Caleb was harder to reach. The boy stayed watchful, protective of his sister, careful never to let his guard down around Gideon. He answered questions with single words. He ate what was offered, but never asked for more. He slept light and woke at every sound. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke. Gideon saddled Rust and prepared to ride into Red Hollow. He needed to report the dead parents, needed to see what arrangements could be made for the children, needed to do the responsible thing, even though some part of him, a part he refused to examine too closely, wanted to keep them right where they were. We're going back, aren't we? Caleb asked. He was standing in the cabin doorway, Emma half hidden behind him. To an orphanage or something. Gideon pulled the saddle cinch tight. I don't know yet. You're going to let them take us. I didn't say that. You didn't say you wouldn't. Gideon turned to face the boy. Caleb's jaw was set, his eyes bright with anger and fear, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. Listen to me, Gideon said carefully. I don't know what happens next. I need to talk to people in town, figure out what's legal, what's possible. But I promise you this. I won't let anyone take you somewhere bad. All right? How would you even know what's bad? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. That's true. Gideon met Caleb's eyes steadily. But I found you. That means something. What does it mean? I'm still figuring that out. Red Hollow in late March was mud and melting snow, and the kind of bitter cold that got into your bones and stayed there. Gideon rode down the main street, really the only street, past the general store, the blacksmith, the assayer's office, and pulled up outside the saloon that doubled as the unofficial town hall. He hadn't been to Red Hollow in 4 months. People noticed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as he passed. Women pulled their children close. Men watched him with wary eyes, hands drifting toward gun belts out of pure instinct. Gideon ignored them all. He tied Russ to the hitching post and pushed through the saloon doors. The noise inside died instantly. Tom Brennan, who ran the place, looked up from behind the bar with an expression that managed to be both surprised and deeply uneasy. Rourke, didn't expect to see you until summer at least. Need to talk to Marshal Davies. He here? Back corner. But Gideon was already walking. He crossed the room in long strides, aware of every eye tracking his movement, every conversation dying in his wake. Marshal John Davies was a weathered man in his 50s, competent enough at keeping basic order but in way over his head when it came to anything complicated. He looked up as Gideon approached, and something like resignation crossed his face. What happened? Davies asked. Gideon pulled out the chair across from him and sat without being invited. Found a wagon up on the Eastern Trail 4 days ago. Man and woman inside, both dead from fever. 2 children still alive. Davies's expression shifted. Christ. How old? Boys maybe 7 or 8. Girls 4, I'd guess. They have any other family? Anyone we can contact? Don't know yet. Didn't find papers. Wagon was registered out of Missouri, from what I could see, but that's all I got. Davies rubbed his face. Where are the kids now? My cabin. That caused a stir. Gideon heard the whispers start behind him. The mountain man with children. What's the world coming to, those poor kids? Someone should do something. Davies heard it too. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Gideon, you can't just keep them. Wasn't planning to kidnap anybody, John. That's why I'm here. I mean, legally you can't keep them. There's protocols. Territorial law requires orphaned children to be placed with proper families or sent to institutions that can care for them. What kind of institutions? Orphanages, usually back east. How far east? St. Louis, most likely. Maybe Chicago. Gideon's jaw tightened. That's a month's travel for kids that age, in wagons with strangers, after what they've been through. I understand that, but do you? Gideon's voice stayed quiet, but something in it made Davies stop talking. Because from where I'm sitting, you're telling me to hand 2 terrified children over to people who'll ship them 1,000 miles away to some building full of other unwanted kids, and I'm having a real hard time seeing how that's in anyone's best interest. It's not about best interest, it's about the law. Then the law's wrong, Davies sighed. Look, I sympathize, I really do, but you're not equipped to raise children. You live alone in a cabin miles from town. You barely speak to people. You have no wife, no family, no support. What kind of life is that for kids? Better than an orphanage. That's not for you to decide. Judge Morrison is due through here in 2 weeks for circuit court. He'll make the determination about placement. And if I want to keep them? Davies looked at him for a long moment. Then you'd better find yourself a wife before he gets here, because the judge sure as hell isn't going to grant custody to a single mountain man with no experience raising children. The words hit Gideon like a physical blow. A wife. He'd never even considered, hadn't thought about marriage in years. What woman would want him? What woman would look at his scars, his silence, his complete inability to function in normal society, and think, yes, that's what I've been waiting for? That's impossible, Gideon said quietly. Then I'm sorry, truly, but those children will be on the next wagon east when Morrison makes his ruling. Gideon stood up slowly. The chair scraped loud in the sudden silence. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, Davies confirmed. Gideon turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, the whispers started up again. Speculation about what he'd do, pity for the children, relief that someone else's problem was being handled. He was halfway across the room when a voice called out. So the mountain man's got himself some orphans now. That's rich. Gideon stopped. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the comment, just stood there, every muscle in his body going still in a way that made smart people nervous. The voice belonged to a drunk named Pete Saunders, one of those men who measured their worth by how much they could diminish others. He was sitting at a table with 3 other miners, all of them well into their cups, despite it being barely noon. "What's the matter, Rourke?" Saunders continued, emboldened by Gideon's lack of response. "You can handle a grizzly, but not a couple of kids? That about the size of it?" Gideon turned slowly. The entire saloon went quiet again. Even the drunk seemed to realize he might have made a mistake. "Those children," Gideon said quietly, "have been through enough. They don't need to hear you running your mouth about things you don't understand."
"Oh, I understand plenty. I understand you're about to lose them because no woman in her right mind would marry something like you." Gideon started walking toward Saunders' table. Marshall Davies stood up quickly. "Gideon, don't!" But Gideon wasn't planning to hit anyone. He stopped a few feet from the table and looked down at Saunders with those cold January eyes. "You're right," he said simply. That surprised everyone, including Saunders.
"I'm not fit for polite company," Gideon continued. "I don't know how to talk pretty or act civilized. I've got no money, no social standing, no reason anyone should want anything to do with me." He paused. "But those kids are alive because I found them, and they're going to stay alive because I'm not giving up on them, no matter what it takes." He let that hang in the air for a moment, then turned back toward the door. He was almost there when the desperate truth of his situation hit him all at once. The impossibility of it, the sheer insanity of what Davies had suggested, the fact that he had exactly 14 days to accomplish something he had no idea how to even attempt. Gideon stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around, didn't look at anyone, just spoke into the silence, his voice rough, with something that might have been desperation or might have been determination. "I need a wife by tomorrow morning." For one heartbeat, the saloon stayed silent. Then someone laughed. Then someone else. Then the entire room exploded. Men doubled over. Women covered their mouths, their eyes bright with shock and amusement. Even Marshall Davies looked like he was fighting a smile. Did he just... The mountain man wants a wife. Hell, Gideon, why stop at one? Why not ask for a unicorn while you're at it? The laughter built and built, feeding on itself, cruel and careless and completely expected. Gideon stood in the doorway and took it, let it wash over him. He'd heard worse, been through worse. This was nothing, except it wasn't nothing, because 2 children were depending on him, and he was failing them already. Tom Brennan tried to restore some order. All right, settle down, the man's serious." "That's what makes it funny," someone shouted. "Look at him. What woman would—" "He lives in a cave, practically." "Does he even own a comb?" Gideon's hands curled into fists at his sides. Not from anger. He'd given up on anger years ago. From helplessness. From the dawning realization that he'd walked into this room with a desperate hope and walked out with nothing but confirmation of what he'd always known. He was alone. He would always be alone. And those children were going to pay the price for his isolation. "Please." The word came out rougher than he intended, quieter, but it cut through the laughter like a knife. The room didn't go silent immediately. It took a few seconds for people to realize he'd spoken again. When they did, the laughter died in awkward fits and starts. Gideon turned around slowly. He looked at the faces staring back at him, some amused, some embarrassed, some openly hostile. He tried to find words that would make them understand, make them see what was at stake. "There are 2 children," he said carefully, "who lost everything. Their parents, their home, everything they knew. They're scared, they're grieving, and in 2 weeks, unless I can prove to Judge Morrison that I can provide a stable home, they're getting shipped 1,000 miles away to an institution where nobody knows their names and nobody cares what happens to them." The laughter had stopped completely now. "I know what you all think of me," Gideon continued. "I know I'm not the kind of man anyone wants around. I know I make you uncomfortable. I know I'm not easy to talk to or be around. But those kids don't care about any of that. They just need someone to protect them, someone to give them a chance." He paused, searching for words that seemed to live just beyond his reach. "I can't do it alone. The law won't let me. So I'm asking—" His voice cracked slightly. He pushed through it. "I'm asking if there's anyone here who'd be willing to help. Not for me. For them." The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, uncomfortable in a new way. People looked at each other, at the floor, anywhere but at Gideon. He waited. Nobody moved. Of course they didn't. Why would they? He was asking for something impossible, asking someone to tie their entire future to a man they barely knew and definitely didn't trust, all for the sake of 2 orphaned children that weren't their responsibility. It was insane. Gideon nodded slowly, accepting the verdict. He'd tried. That would have to be enough. He turned toward the door for the 3rd time. "Wait!" The voice came from the back of the room. Female. Quiet, but clear. Gideon froze. The entire saloon turned to look. A woman stood up slowly. She'd been sitting alone at a corner table, so still and unremarkable that Gideon genuinely hadn't noticed her until she spoke. She was maybe 30, maybe older, hard to tell with frontier women who'd seen too much hard weather. Dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, worn dress that had been mended more than once, face that might have been pretty once before life wore the softness away. Gideon recognized her vaguely. Clara something. A widow who'd come through town a year or 2 back and never left. She worked at the boarding house, kept to herself, spoke to almost nobody. She was looking directly at him now. "You said they need someone to protect them," Clara said. Her voice was steadier than Gideon expected. "Is that true? Or do they need someone to actually care for them?" The question landed like a stone in still water. "Both," Gideon admitted. Clara nodded slowly. She started walking toward him. People shifted out of her way, watching her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. She stopped a few feet from Gideon and looked up at him steadily. She was tall for a woman, but still had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I need to know something," she said quietly, "and I need the truth." "All right." She took a breath. The entire saloon was watching now, dead silent, waiting. Clara looked at Gideon with eyes that had seen their own share of grief and asked the only question that mattered. "Will you be kind to them?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore and impossible to answer quickly. Gideon stared at Clara Whitmore, trying to understand what she was actually asking. Kindness wasn't something he'd thought about in years. It wasn't a word that came up much in the mountains. You survived, or you didn't. You were useful, or you weren't. Kindness was something soft people in soft places could afford to think about. But standing there in that saloon with every eye on him, Gideon realized Clara wasn't asking about philosophy. She was asking about intent, about what kind of man he'd be when nobody was watching, about whether those children would be safe not just from hunger and cold, but from him. "I don't know how to answer that," he said finally. His voice came out rough, uncertain. "I've never had to be kind before, never had anyone to be kind to." Someone in the crowd snorted. Clara's expression didn't change. "That's not what I asked," she said quietly. "I asked if you will be. Not if you know how. Not if you've practiced. If you will try." Gideon's throat felt tight. He looked at this woman he barely knew, this widow who was somehow the only person in the entire room willing to even consider what he was asking, and tried to give her an honest answer. "Yes," he said. "I don't know what that looks like exactly. I don't have manners. I don't know how to talk to children or make them feel safe or any of the things they probably need. But I swear to you, I will spend every day trying to do right by them, trying to be gentle when they need gentle and strong when they need strong, and whatever else they need that I don't even know about yet." He paused, searching her face for some reaction. "I found them half frozen in a wagon with their dead parents," he continued, quieter now. "The girl, Emma, she was so cold she'd stopped shivering. The boy, Caleb, he tried to fight me off even though he's barely waist-high and starving. They've got nobody left in the world except each other, and if I let them get sent away, they won't even have that. The institution split up siblings all the time." Claire's eyes flickered at that. Something moved behind them, old pain, old memory. "So yes," Gideon finished, "I will be kind to them. I'll probably do it wrong half the time. I'll make mistakes. But I won't stop trying." The silence stretched out. Gideon could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 50 pairs of eyes watching this impossible conversation unfold. Clara nodded once, slowly. Then she turned to face the room. "Anyone here know me?" she asked. A few people raised their hands tentatively. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Patterson, spoke up. "I know you, Clara. You've worked for me going on 18 months now." "Have I ever been late?" Ever shirked work? Ever caused trouble? No, ma'am. You're the best worker I've got. Clara turned to Tom Brennan behind the bar. You know me? I do. You come in here sometimes for supper. Always polite, always quiet. Ever see me drunk? Ever see me acting inappropriate?
No, ma'am. You barely drink at all. Clara looked at Marshall Davies. You know me, John? Davies shifted uncomfortably. I do. You've never caused me a moment's trouble. Then you all know I'm not crazy. You know I'm not impulsive. You know I think before I act. She let that settle, then looked back at Gideon. I'm going to ask you some questions. I need real answers, not pretty ones. Gideon nodded. Do you drink? Sometimes, not often, never enough to lose control. Do you have a temper? No, I go quiet when I'm angry. Have you ever hit a woman? Never. A child? Never. Do you gamble? No. Do you owe money to anyone? No. How do you make your living? Trapping mostly, some hunting. I sell pelts in town twice a year. Is it enough to feed 4 people instead of 1? That one made Gideon pause. He'd never thought about it in those terms. I'd have to trap more, work harder. But yes, I think so. Your cabin, how big is it? 1 room. But I could add on. There's timber enough, and I know how to build. How far from town? 3 miles, maybe 4. How often do you come to Red Hollow? Few times a year, sometimes less. Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. The room waited. If I did this, she said slowly, if I agreed to marry you and help raise these children, would you expect me to be a real wife? In all the ways that means? The question was blunt enough to make several people gasp. Gideon felt his face heat up, which was ridiculous given that he'd faced down charging bears without flinching. I'd expect you to be whatever you wanted to be, he said carefully. I'm not asking for a wife in that sense. I'm asking for help saving 2 kids. Anything beyond that would be up to you. So this would be a marriage of convenience, on paper only. If that's what you want, yes. And if I wanted it to be more eventually, if I wanted a real marriage? Gideon's throat went dry. Then I'd try my best to be a decent husband, but I can't promise I'd be good at it. Clara studied him for a long moment. Gideon couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if she was considering it seriously or just making a point. Let me see your hands, she said finally. What? Your hands, show me. Gideon held out his hands, palms up. They were exactly what you'd expect from someone who lived his life. Scarred, calloused, permanently stained dark around the nail beds, knuckles that had been broken and healed crooked. Clara stepped closer and took his right hand in both of hers, turning it over, examining it like she was reading something written there. These are working hands, she said quietly. Honest hands. They've hurt, but not cruelly. They've killed, but for survival. They've built things and fixed things, and kept you alive in a place that kills most men. She looked up at him. Can these hands be gentle with a 4-year-old girl who cries for her mother at night? The question hit Gideon harder than any punch ever had. I don't know, he admitted, but I held her all the way back to my cabin during that storm, and I didn't drop her once. That's not the same as tenderness. No. But it's a start. Clara released his hand and stepped back. She looked at the crowd, then at Marshall Davies, then back at Gideon. I lost a husband and a son 5 years ago, she said. Not to Gideon specifically, but to the room. Like she needed everyone to understand. Cholera took them both in the same week. I buried them in Illinois and I kept traveling west because I couldn't stand to be in that town anymore. In that house, with all those memories. Her voice stayed level, factual, but Gideon could hear the grief underneath it, old and deep and permanent. I've been alone since then, Clara continued, working in boarding houses, saving money, trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life. And I've been angry at fate, at sickness, at myself for surviving when they didn't. She looked directly at Gideon. But I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of being alone. And if there are 2 children who need a mother, even a broken one, even one who doesn't know what she's doing anymore, then maybe that's reason enough. Someone in the crowd started to say something. Clara held up a hand, silencing them. This isn't charity, she said firmly. This isn't me being noble or sacrificing myself. This is me choosing to do something that matters instead of just existing. So if we do this, Gideon Rourke, we do it as partners. Equals. You don't get to make all the decisions about those children just because you found them, and I don't get to take over your life just because I'm a woman who knows how to keep house. Understood? Understood. And if it doesn't work, if we can't stand each other, or if those children would be better off elsewhere, we figure it out honestly. No lying. No pretending everything's fine when it's not. Agreed. Clara took a deep breath. The entire saloon seemed to be holding their breath with her. Then yes, she said, I'll marry you. The room exploded again, but differently this time. Shock instead of laughter. Disbelief instead of mockery. A dozen voices all talking at once. Clara, you can't be serious. You don't know him. This is insane. Someone needs to stop this. Marshall Davies stood up, his face conflicted. Clara, I need to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. This man is a stranger. You'd be legally bound to him. If things go wrong, I'll handle it the same way I've handled everything else in my life, Clara said calmly, by surviving and moving forward. But, John, I appreciate your concern, but I'm a grown woman and I know my own mind. If you're worried about my safety, don't be. I'm harder to kill than I look. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd. Clara, dear, at least take a few days to think about this. You don't have to decide right now. Yes, I do. Gideon said he needs a wife by tomorrow morning. The judge is coming in 2 weeks. There's no time for thinking. But marriage is a legal contract. Nothing more, nothing less. I've signed contracts before. Tom Brennan cleared his throat. With all due respect, ma'am, it's a bit more complicated than that. Clara turned to face him. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it's pretty simple. 2 children need parents. I can be a mother. He can be a father. Together we can give them a home. What's complicated about that? Nobody seemed to have an answer. Gideon watched Clara defend their arrangement, an arrangement they'd made less than 5 minutes ago, with the kind of calm certainty he'd only ever seen in people who'd already survived the worst life could throw at them. She wasn't doing this because she loved him. She wasn't doing it because she thought it would be easy or happy, or any of the things people usually wanted from marriage. She was doing it because she'd looked at 2 orphaned children she'd never met and decided they mattered more than her own comfort. Gideon had never respected anyone more in his life. We'll need someone to perform the ceremony, Clara said, practical as ever. John, can you do it? Marshals can officiate weddings, can't they? Davies looked pained. They can, but Clara's, tomorrow morning, early, before anyone can talk us out of it. She looked at Gideon. That work for you? Yes. Then it's settled. Clara turned back to the marshal. We'll need witnesses. Mrs. Patterson, would you stand for me? The boarding house owner looked like she was having a crisis of conscience. I don't know if I can support this, dear. I'm not asking you to support it. I'm asking you to witness it. There's a difference. Clara, please, Martha. I need someone there who knows me, who can testify that I entered this marriage of my own free will with full understanding of what I was doing. Mrs. Patterson's resistance crumbled. Oh, all right, but I still think you're making a terrible mistake. Noted. Clara looked at Gideon. You need a witness, too. Gideon scanned the room. He didn't have friends in Red Hollow, didn't have people he could ask for favors. His eyes landed on Tom Brennan, who'd at least tried to restore order earlier. Tom, Gideon asked, you willing? The bartender looked startled. Me? I barely know you. That makes us even. Tom laughed despite himself. Hell, why not? This is the strangest thing I've seen in 20 years behind this bar. Might as well be part of it. Marshall Davies rubbed his face, looking exhausted. You're all out of your minds. You know that, right? Probably, Clara agreed. But we're doing it anyway. Tomorrow morning. What time, John? 7 o'clock. At my office. And I'm filing a report with Judge Morrison about the circumstances, so he knows this was done to secure custody of those children. No deception. Wouldn't have it any other way. Davies shook his head. This is going to end badly. Maybe, Clara said. Or maybe it'll end exactly the way it's supposed to. The crowd started to disperse, people drifting back to their drinks and conversations, though the buzz of gossip was already building. This would be the talk of Red Hollow for months, maybe years. Gideon found himself standing there with Clara, neither of them quite sure what to do next. I should probably meet them, Clara said finally. The children, before we do this. Now? Is there a better time?
Gideon couldn't think of one. All right, but the cabin's a 3-mile ride and I only have one horse.
I can walk. Not in this mud you can't. You'd be knee-deep before we made it a quarter mile.
Gideon thought for a moment.
You can ride with me, if that's all right. Clara nodded. Let me get my coat. She disappeared into the back room of the saloon where she'd apparently left her things. Gideon stood there alone, acutely aware of the stares still directed his way.
Marshal Davies approached, keeping his voice low. You better be good to her, Rourke. Clara's been through enough. I will be. And those kids, if I hear anything at all that suggests they're being mistreated, you won't. See that I don't. Clara reappeared wearing a worn wool coat and carrying a small bag. She looked at Gideon. Ready? They walked out of the saloon together. Behind them, Gideon could hear the conversation starting up again, voices thick with speculation and judgment. He untied Rust from the hitching post and swung up into the saddle, then offered Clara his hand. She took it without hesitation and let him pull her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back carefully, keeping a respectful distance. You'll want to hold on, Gideon said. Trail's rough. Clara wrapped her arms around his waist, her grip firm, but not tight. Gideon tried not to think about the fact that this was the first time in 19 years that he'd been this close to another person. He nudged Rust forward, and they started toward the mountains. They rode in silence for the first mile. The trail was exactly as bad as Gideon had warned, muddy, rutted, covered in fallen branches from the recent storm. Rust picked her way carefully through the mess. Tell me about them, Clara said eventually. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of the wind through the pines. The children? Yes. Gideon thought about how to describe Caleb and Emma to someone who'd never met them. Emma's 4. Hasn't talked much since I found her. She cries sometimes at night, but quiet-like, trying not to be heard. During the day, she just watches everything. She's got this rag doll she carries everywhere. And the boy? Caleb's older, 7 or 8, I think. He's protective of his sister. Won't let her out of his sight. Doesn't trust me worth a damn, which is probably smart on his part. Does he talk? When he has to. Doesn't waste words. Sounds like someone else I know. Gideon almost smiled. He's braver than I was at his age. When I found them in that wagon, he tried to fight me off even though he was half frozen and starving. Put himself between me and Emma like he actually thought he could stop me. That's not bravery. That's love. The observation hit Gideon sideways. He'd never thought about it like that. They rode in silence for another half-mile before Clara spoke again. I need you to understand something, she said. I'm doing this for those children. Not for you. Not for me. For them. I know. Which means if you lie to me, if you hurt them, if you're anything other than what you promised back in that saloon, I will make sure you regret it. I don't care how big you are or how scary people think you are. You understand? Gideon did smile at that, small and brief. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now tell me what they eat, what they like, what scares them. I need to know who I'm walking into this for. So Gideon told her about Emma's nightmares, about how Caleb checked the locks on the door 3 times every night, about the way Emma had smiled when she saw that squirrel, about how Caleb had asked if he could keep his parents' wedding rings, the only things he'd taken from the wagon. Clara listened without interrupting, her arms steady around his waist as Rust carried them higher into the mountains. They don't know about tomorrow, do they? She asked. About us getting married? No, I wasn't sure it would happen. We should tell them together, give them a chance to object if they want to. You think they will? I think they've lost control of every part of their lives. The least we can do is let them have a voice in this. Gideon hadn't considered that. He'd been so focused on finding a solution, on meeting the judge's requirements, that he hadn't thought about whether Caleb and Emma would want Clara there. The cabin appeared through the trees, a rough timber structure with a stone chimney and a single window covered in oiled paper. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. Gideon helped Clara down from the horse, then dismounted himself. He could see movement through the window. Caleb, probably, watching their approach. It's not much, Gideon said. I know it's fine, Clara interrupted. She was looking at the cabin with an expression Gideon couldn't quite read. I've lived in worse. They walked to the door. Gideon pushed it open. Caleb was standing just inside, holding a knife that was too big for him, but which he gripped like he knew how to use it. Emma was behind him, clutching her doll. The boy's eyes went from Gideon to Clara and back again, suspicious and alert. "Who's she?" Caleb demanded. "Her name's Clara Whitmore," Gideon said carefully. We need to talk. All of us." "About what?" "About what happens next. Can you put the knife down, Caleb?" The boy didn't move. "Why'd you bring a stranger here?" "Because she's not going to be a stranger. Not after tomorrow." Gideon stepped inside, giving Clara room to follow. "Please, put the knife down and listen." Caleb held his ground for another moment, then slowly lowered the weapon. He didn't put it away, though, just held it at his side, ready. Clara moved into the cabin slowly, her eyes taking in everything: the rough furniture, the fire, the 2 small pallets Gideon had made up for the children. Her gaze landed on Emma and softened immediately. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently. Emma stared at her with wide eyes but didn't respond. Clara looked at Caleb. "You must be Caleb. Gideon told me about you. He said you're very brave." "He say anything else?" "He said you take good care of your sister, that she's lucky to have you." That seemed to surprise the boy. He glanced at Gideon, then back at Clara. "What do you want?" "To help, if you'll let me." "We don't need help." "Caleb," Gideon said quietly, "let me explain." He pulled out one of the rough chairs he'd built and sat down so he wouldn't be towering over them. Clara did the same. Caleb stayed standing, Emma pressed against his side. "I went to town today to talk to the marshal," Gideon started, "to figure out what happens to you two. What the law says about orphaned children." Caleb's face went hard. "They're going to send us away. They're going to try. There's a judge coming in 2 weeks. Unless I can prove I can take care of you properly, he'll send you to an orphanage back east. Then prove it. It's not that simple. The law says I need a wife, a family. I can't keep you on my own." Emma's grip on her doll tightened. Caleb's knuckles went white around the knife handle. "So that's it?" the boy said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "You're giving up?" "No, I'm getting married." Silence. Caleb looked at Clara, then back at Gideon. "To her?" "Yes. Tomorrow morning." "You don't even know her." "No, I don't, but she's willing to help. She's willing to stand up in front of the marshal and make this legal so you two can stay here." "Why?" Caleb directed the question at Clara. "Why would you do that for people you don't know?" Clara met his eyes steadily. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, and because I think you deserve better than being shipped off to some institution where nobody knows your names. You feel sorry for us." "No, I respect you. There's a difference." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Emma tugged on his sleeve, whispering something Gideon couldn't hear. "Emma wants to know if you're going to take us away from Gideon," Caleb translated. Clara shook her head. "No, sweetheart. I'm going to help him keep you here, if that's what you want. And if we don't want you here, then we'll figure something else out." Gideon watched this exchange, watched Clara handle Caleb's suspicion with the kind of patient honesty the boy needed. She wasn't trying to charm them or win them over with false promises. She was just being direct. "Can I talk to Emma alone?" Clara asked. "Just for a minute?" Caleb's jaw set. "No." "Caleb," Gideon said, "she's not going to hurt her." "You don't know that." "Actually, I do. Clara asked me one question in that saloon before she agreed to any of this. She asked if I would be kind to you. That's all she cared about. Not money, not land, not anything else. Just whether you'd be safe." Caleb looked at Clara with new eyes, reassessing. "I won't take her out of your sight," Clara said. "We can sit right here. You can watch the whole time. I just want to talk to her without you having to translate. Is that all right?" The boy looked down at his sister. Emma nodded, just barely. "Fine," Caleb said. "But I'm standing right here." Clara knelt down in front of Emma, putting herself at the girl's eye level. Gideon watched, fascinated, as Clara's entire demeanor changed, softened somehow, became less guarded. "Emma," Clara said gently, "I had a little boy once. He was 6 years old. His name was Thomas." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "Thomas died 5 years ago," Clara continued. Her voice stayed steady, but Gideon could hear the effort it took.
And I've missed him every single day since then. I've missed being someone's mother. I've missed having someone to take care of. She paused, letting that settle. I know I'm not your mother. I know nothing can replace her. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be someone who cares about you, someone who makes sure you have warm meals and clean clothes, and someone to talk to when you're sad. Emma stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice so small Gideon almost missed it, she whispered, "Do you know any songs?" Clara's face transformed. Not quite a smile, but something close. "I know a few. Would you like to hear one?" Emma nodded. And there, in that rough mountain cabin, Clara Whitmore began to sing. It was a simple tune, the kind of lullaby mothers had been singing to children for generations. Her voice was untrained but true, and Emma listened with an intensity that suggested she was hearing something she desperately needed. When the song ended, Emma stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around Clara's neck. Clara held her carefully, her eyes closing briefly against emotion Gideon didn't have words for. Caleb watched this with an expression that warred between hope and suspicion. When Emma finally pulled back, the boy spoke up. "If we let you marry Gideon, if we let you stay here, does that mean you're going to try to be our mother?" Clara looked at him honestly. "I'm going to try to be whatever you need me to be. If you need a mother, I'll do my best. If you just need someone to cook and keep house, I can do that too. You get to decide, Caleb, both of you. And when you figure out this isn't what you wanted, when you get tired of us or decide it's too hard, then what?" The question came from deep experience. This boy had already been abandoned once, by death, if not by choice. He knew how easily people disappeared. "I won't lie to you and say I'll never leave," Clara said quietly. "I can't promise I'll live forever, or that nothing will ever go wrong. But I can promise you this. If I make this commitment tomorrow, I mean it. I don't do things halfway. Ask anyone in town." Caleb looked at Gideon. "What about you? You going to keep us even after you get what you need from her?" The question stung, but Gideon understood it. "Yes." "How do we know?" "You don't." "Not for sure. But I've got 2 weeks to prove it to you before that judge shows up, and I plan to use every day of it." The boy thought about that. Emma tugged his sleeve again, whispered something. "Emma wants to know if we get our own room," Caleb said. Gideon looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Neither of them had thought that far ahead. "I'll build you one," Gideon said. "Start tomorrow after the ceremony. It'll take a few weeks, but you'll have your own space." "With a real door?" "With a real door." Caleb looked down at his sister, then at the cabin around them, then at the two adults who were asking him to trust them with his and Emma's future. "Okay," he said finally, "but if either of you hurts her, I'll kill you." The boy was 7 years old and holding a knife he could barely lift, making a threat against a man twice his size and a woman he'd just met. Clara nodded seriously. "That's fair." Gideon felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope. He didn't trust hope yet, but something close to it. "We should talk about tomorrow," he said. "About what happens during the ceremony. You should both be there." "Why?" Caleb asked. "Because this is about you as much as it's about us. The judge needs to see that we're a family, all 4 of us." They spent the next hour working through details. What time they'd need to leave for town, what the children should wear, what they'd say if the judge asked them questions. Clara proved to be practical about everything. She asked about food supplies, about how washing got done, about where she'd sleep. She measured the cabin with her eyes, and Gideon could see her already planning changes, improvements. As the sun started to set, Gideon realized Clara would need to get back to town. "I should take you back before it gets full dark," he said. "Trail's dangerous in the dark." Clara looked at the children, then at him. "Or I could stay here tonight, start getting them used to me being around." Caleb tensed immediately. "Just to sleep," Clara clarified. "I'll take whatever space you can spare. I just think it might be easier for them if tomorrow isn't the first time they've seen me in their home." Gideon saw the logic in it. "Caleb, what do you think?" The boy looked at Emma. The girl nodded. "Fine," Caleb said, "but we keep the knife." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Clara said. They worked out the sleeping arrangements. Clara would take Gideon's bed. Gideon would sleep on the floor near the fire. The children would stay where they'd been. That night, after a quiet supper that Clara helped prepare, after Emma had been tucked into bed and Caleb had checked the locks, after the fire had burned down to coals,
Gideon lay awake in the dark and listened to 3 other people breathing in his cabin. Tomorrow he'd be married to a woman he barely knew. Tomorrow those children would legally become his responsibility. Tomorrow his entire life would change in ways he couldn't predict and definitely couldn't control. He should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in 19 years, Gideon Rourke felt something that might have been peace. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that made you question every decision you'd ever made. Gideon woke to the sound of Clara moving quietly around the cabin, already dressed, already working. She'd found his coffee, what little he had, and was heating water over the fire. He sat up, his back stiff from sleeping on the floor, and watched her work. She moved efficiently, no wasted motion, like someone who'd spent years making do with less than enough. "You didn't have to start breakfast," he said. Clara glanced over her shoulder. "Someone had to. The children will be awake soon, and they should eat before we go." She was right. Emma was already stirring on her pallet, rubbing her eyes. Caleb was awake too. Gideon suspected the boy hadn't slept much at all. They ate a simple meal of cornmeal mush and the last of yesterday's bread. Nobody talked much. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on all of them. When they'd finished, Clara helped Emma into the least worn of her 2 dresses, while Gideon tried to make himself presentable. He owned 1 shirt without holes, 1 pair of pants that weren't patched to death. He did what he could with his hair, which wasn't much. Caleb watched these preparations with the same wary expression he'd worn since Clara arrived. "You're really doing this," the boy said. It wasn't a question. "We are," Gideon confirmed. "And after, what happens then?" "Then we come back here and start building that room I promised you." "That's it?" "What else would there be?" Caleb shrugged, but his eyes were troubled. "People always say things are going to change, that everything's going to be better. Then it's not." Clara knelt in front of him, careful not to invade his space. "You're right, sometimes things get worse instead of better. Sometimes promises don't mean anything, but sometimes, not always, but sometimes, people do exactly what they say they're going to do." "How do we know which kind you are?" "You don't. Not yet. That's what these next 2 weeks are for." The ride into Red Hollow took longer with all 4 of them. Clara rode behind Gideon with Emma settled in front of her. Caleb sat in front of Gideon, rigid and alert, watching the trail like he expected it to swallow them whole. The town was just waking up when they arrived. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few early risers moved along the muddy street. Word about yesterday's saloon drama had clearly spread. People stopped to stare as they passed, conversations dying mid-sentence. Gideon ignored them all. He tied Rust outside the marshal's office and helped everyone down. Marshal Davies was waiting inside, along with Mrs. Patterson and Tom Brennan. The marshal looked like he hadn't slept well. Mrs. Patterson kept wringing her hands. Tom just looked amused by the whole situation. "You all actually showed up," Davies said. "I half expected you to come to your senses overnight." "We're here," Clara said simply. "Let's get this done." Davies pulled out the necessary papers and set them on his desk. "Before we start, I need to make sure you both understand what you're entering into. This is a legal marriage, binding in the eyes of the law. You'll have the same rights and responsibilities as any married couple." "We understand," Gideon said. "Clara, you're sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything, John. Stop trying to talk me out of it." Davies sighed and picked up his pen. "All right then. Gideon Rourke, do you take Clara Whitmore as your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" The word sounded strange coming from Davies's mouth. Formal. Old. Gideon had never been to a wedding before, not even his parents, obviously. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel. "I do," he said. "Clara Whitmore, do you take Gideon Rourke as your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward?" Clara's voice didn't waver. "I do." "Do you have rings?" Gideon and Clara looked at each other. Neither had thought about rings. "No," Gideon said. Davies nodded. "That's fine. Not required. Tom, Martha, you're here as witnesses. You confirm both parties entered this marriage willingly and of sound mind?" "They're out of their minds," Mrs. Patterson muttered. "But yes, they did it willingly." Tom grinned. What she said. Davies made notes on the paperwork, then looked up. "Then by the authority vested in me as Marshal of Red Hollow, I pronounce you husband and wife." He paused. You're supposed to kiss now. If you want to. Gideon felt his face heat up. He looked at Clara, who looked back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. We don't have to, she said quietly. Might look strange if we don't. Since when do you care what looks strange? She had a point, but there were other people watching, including a territorial judge who'd be arriving in less than 2 weeks to evaluate their situation. Everything they did from this moment forward would be scrutinized. Gideon leaned down and kissed Clara's cheek, brief and awkward. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. It was the most chaste kiss in the history of marriages, and somehow that felt exactly right. Well, Davies said, that's done then. I'll file the papers with the territorial office. When Judge Morrison arrives, I'll present this as evidence that you're providing a stable home for the children. What else will he need to see? Clara asked. The living situation. That you're both employed or have means of support. That the children are being fed, clothed, educated if possible. He'll interview them separately to make sure they're not being coerced or mistreated. Caleb tensed at that. Emma pressed closer to Clara. They can tell him the truth, Gideon said. We're not afraid of what they'll say. Davies looked at the children, his expression softening. I hope it works out. For their sake, more than yours. They signed the papers. Mrs. Patterson and Tom added their signatures as witnesses, and just like that, Gideon Rourke was married. He'd expected it to feel different somehow, heavier, more significant. Instead, it just felt like paperwork, official and binding, but strangely empty. Clara seemed to feel the same way. She tucked the marriage certificate into her bag with the same practicality she'd shown everything else, then turned to Mrs. Patterson. Martha, I'll need to collect my things from the boarding house. Give notice. You're leaving today? No point in waiting. Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled. Clara, please, think about what you're doing. I have thought about it. I'm doing it anyway. But you have a good situation with me. Steady work, a clean room, friends. I have acquaintances, Martha, not friends. There's a difference. Clara's voice gentled. You've been good to me. I appreciate that. But this is the right choice. How can you possibly know that? Clara glanced at Emma, who was holding her rag doll and watching the adults with wide, solemn eyes. Because for the first time in 5 years, I have a reason to get up in the morning that isn't just survival. They walked to the boarding house together, all 4 of them plus Mrs. Patterson, who kept up a steady stream of worried commentary the entire way. Clara's room was on the 2nd floor, small and neat and completely impersonal. She owned almost nothing. 2 dresses, some underclothings, a hairbrush, a few books. It all fit in a single trunk. Gideon carried the trunk downstairs while Clara said her goodbyes to the other boarders. Most of them looked shocked. A few looked judgmental. One older woman pulled Clara aside and whispered something Gideon couldn't hear. Whatever it was made Clara laugh, an actual laugh, genuine and surprised. I'll keep that in mind, Ruth, she said. They loaded the trunk onto Rust, who was not happy about the extra weight, but tolerated it. The ride back to the cabin was quiet. Emma had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder. Caleb stayed rigid and watchful. When the cabin came into view, Clara studied it with new eyes, not as a visitor now, but as someone who'd be living there. It needs work, she said. I know. The roof's going to leak when the spring rains come. The chinking between the logs is failing. That window needs real glass, not just paper, and we'll need more space if we're all going to live here without killing each other. Gideon helped her down from the horse. I'll start on the addition tomorrow. Today, Clara corrected. Those children need their own room before the judge arrives. That means we have less than 2 weeks to build it. That's not much time. Then we'd better work fast. They spent the rest of that day organizing. Clara took stock of supplies, made lists of what they'd need from town, reorganized the cabin's interior to make better use of the limited space. Gideon started clearing ground for the addition, measuring out where the walls would go. Caleb helped, mostly by staying close and asking questions about every single decision. Why are you putting it on that side? The boy asked. Because that's where the ground's most level. What about when it snows? Snow will pile up everywhere regardless, but this side gets more sun in winter, which will help keep it warmer. How do you know? I've lived here 19 years. You'll learn where the sun hits. Caleb thought about that. You really going to build this before the judge comes? I'm going to try.
And if you can't, then I'll work through the nights, whatever it takes.
The boy watched Gideon clear brush for a while longer, then asked the question that had clearly been eating at him. Why do you care so much? About us, I mean. We're nothing to you. Gideon stopped working and straightened up. His back was already protesting the labor, and they'd barely started. You remember when I found you? He asked. Of course I remember. I could have kept writing, should have, probably. Storm like that, smart thing would have been to get home fast as possible. So why didn't you? Gideon looked at the boy. This fierce, scared, brave kid who'd tried to protect his sister with nothing but a too-big knife and sheer determination. Because I know what it's like to be alone, he said quietly. To feel like nobody in the world gives a damn whether you live or die. And I couldn't leave you feeling that way. Not if I could help it. Were you an orphan too? In a way. My parents died when I was 15. Old enough to survive on my own, barely. But I remember what it felt like the ground had disappeared and I was just falling. Caleb nodded slowly. It's like that. Exactly like that. They worked in silence for a while, clearing ground, marking where posts would go. Inside the cabin, Gideon could hear Clara's voice, soft and steady, talking to Emma about something. The girl's higher voice responded, not quite conversation, but closer than she'd been. That night, they ate together at the rough table Gideon had built years ago. Clara had managed to make something better than his usual fare out of the same basic supplies. The bread was actually soft. The beans had flavor.
How'd you do that? Gideon asked. Do what?
Make food taste like something other than food.
Clara almost smiled. It's called seasoning. And vegetables. Concepts you apparently haven't encountered. I had an onion once. 1 onion in 19 years. How festive. Emma giggled. An actual giggle, small and quickly stifled, but real. Everyone stopped and looked at her. The girl's face flushed and she ducked her head, but Gideon saw Clara's expression transform. Not quite joy, too soon for that, but something close. After dinner, Clara insisted on establishing routines. The children would wash their faces and hands before bed. They'd sleep at regular times. They'd have clean clothes at least twice a week. We're not savages, she said, directing this at Gideon more than the children. Just because we're living in the wilderness doesn't mean we can't have standards. Yes, ma'am. And stop calling me ma'am. It makes me feel like a school teacher. What should I call you? Clara paused, considering. Clara works fine. That night, after the children were asleep, Gideon and Clara sat by the fire and had their first real conversation as husband and wife. This is strange, Clara said quietly. Which part? All of it. Being married to someone I don't know, living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, taking care of children who aren't mine. You can still change your mind. We could probably get the marriage annulled if— I'm not changing my mind, Clara interrupted. I'm just saying it's strange. I'm allowed to think things are strange. Fair enough. They sat in silence for a while. The fire popped and crackled. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. Tell me about your son, Gideon said. Clara looked at him sharply. Why? Because you mentioned him yesterday, and then you've barely said his name since. Seems like maybe you need to talk about him. I don't need anything. All right, I'd like to hear about him then. Clara's jaw tightened. For a moment, Gideon thought she'd refuse. Then something in her face shifted, and she started talking. Thomas was 6 when he died. He had red hair like his father, freckles. He hated sitting still, always climbing things, running, making noise. Her voice stayed level, factual. He was sick for 3 days before we realized it was cholera. By then it was too late. He died on a Tuesday morning. My husband, Daniel, died that night. I buried them both on Wednesday. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything. No, but it's still true. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. In the firelight, she looked younger and older at the same time. I was angry for years, she said, at the sickness, at Daniel for dying and leaving me alone, at Thomas for dying first so his father had to watch it happen, at myself for not being able to save either of them. She paused. I'm still angry sometimes. That makes sense. Does it? Because most people think I should be over it by now. 5 years is a long time to grieve. There's no time limit on that kind of loss. Clara looked at him with something like surprise. You sound like you know from experience. Everyone loses people. Some of us just stop talking about it. Who did you lose? Gideon stared into the fire. He'd spent 19 years not talking about this, not thinking about it. But Clara had been honest with him. He owed her the same. My mother died giving birth to a baby that didn't survive. I was 8. My father lasted another 7 years, then died in a mining accident. I had an older brother who was supposed to take care of me, but he took off the day after the funeral. Never saw him again. So you've been alone since you were 15, eh? More or less. That's why you live up here, why you don't come to town. Easier than trying to fit in somewhere I don't belong. Clara nodded slowly. I understand that. After Thomas and Daniel died, I kept moving west because every town I stopped in, people would try to help, try to fix me, like I was broken furniture that just needed the right tools. She laughed bitterly. I got tired of being a project. Easier to be alone. But you're not alone anymore. Neither are you. They looked at each other across the fire. Two people who'd spent years learning how to survive isolation, now bound together by legal papers and 2 sleeping children. This is going to be hard, Clara said. Probably. We're going to make mistakes, get on each other's nerves, regret this whole thing at some point. Most likely. But we're doing it anyway. We are. Clara stood up and brushed off her dress. Then we should probably get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She was right. The next morning, Gideon started serious work on the addition while Clara took stock of what the cabin needed to function for 4 people instead of 1. The list was extensive and expensive. We need dishes, she said. Real plates. Not just those tin things you've got. Cups that don't leak. Another pot for cooking. Fabric for curtains and clothes for the children. Those things they're wearing are practically rags. Soap. Real soap, not just lye and ashes. A proper wash tub. Blankets. Seeds for a garden come spring. Sugar. Salt. Coffee that isn't mostly dirt. Gideon looked at the growing list and felt his stomach sink. That's going to cost money I don't have. How much do you have? Maybe $30 saved up. That's from a year of trapping. Clara did math in her head. Not enough. Not even close. We'll need at least double that, probably more. I can trap more. Work harder. Trapping season's mostly over for the year, and you can't trap if you're building a room for the children. Clara chewed her lip, thinking. I could work. Take in washing or mending from town. That's a 6-mile round trip through mud and snow, and it won't pay enough. They were both quiet, the weight of logistics pressing down on the fragile hope they'd built. There might be another way, Gideon said slowly. What? There's a bounty on the wolf pack that's been hitting ranches south of here. $100 if someone can take them out. Clara's eyes narrowed. How dangerous is that? Depends on the wolves. That's not an answer. It's dangerous. But I've hunted wolves before. And if something happens to you, if you get hurt or killed chasing $100, then you and the children will have the money you need to make it through until the judge comes. That's not... Gideon, we need you alive. The judge won't give custody to a widow, and even if he did, I don't know how to survive out here. You think I can hunt, build, track game? She was right, but so was he. They needed money. The bounty was the fastest way to get it. I'll be careful, he said. Men who say that usually end up dead. What else do you want me to do, Clara? We need supplies. We need that money. I'm not going to let those children suffer because I was too scared to take a risk. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. Fine, but you're not doing it alone. I work alone. Not anymore you don't. If you're going after wolves, I'm coming with you. You don't know how to hunt. Then teach me. You've got until tomorrow morning. They argued about it for the rest of the day, but Clara wouldn't budge. Finally, Gideon gave up and agreed to let her come, though he had no intention of letting her get anywhere near the actual danger. That evening, he started showing her the basics. How to load and fire his rifle, how to move quietly through brush, how to read tracks and sign. Clara learned fast, absorbing information like she'd been starving for something useful to do. Caleb watched these preparations with growing alarm. You're both leaving? He asked. Just for a day or two, Gideon said. Mrs. Patterson will come stay with you and Emma. No. Caleb, I said no. You're not leaving us with some stranger. Clara knelt down to his level.
Martha's not a stranger. She's known me for over a year. She's safe. You don't know that. You don't know what people do when nobody's watching. The words carried weight that went beyond this situation. Gideon realized the boy was speaking from experience. What happened, Caleb? Clara asked gently. Before you and Emma were with your parents, who hurt you? The boy's face went hard. Nobody. You don't trust adults around your sister. That doesn't come from nowhere. I just don't, that's all. Clara looked at Gideon, who shook his head slightly. Push too hard and the boy would shut down completely. All right, Clara said. Then you come with us. What? Gideon and Caleb said simultaneously. If you don't trust anyone else to watch Emma, then you come along and Emma stays with Martha. That way you're with us, Emma's safe in town, and everyone's accounted for. I'm 8 years old, Caleb protested. I can't hunt wolves. No, but you can help track them. Help set up camp. Keep watch while we sleep. Make yourself useful. The boy looked torn between pride at being included and fear of what that inclusion meant. I don't want Emma alone with that woman, he said. She won't be alone. Martha runs a boarding house full of people, and we'll be gone 2 days at most. Emma will be safe. Caleb looked at his sister, who'd been listening to this entire conversation with her usual silent intensity. Emmy? You okay with that? The little girl thought about it, then nodded. You sure? Another nod. Caleb turned back to Clara and Gideon. If anything happens to her, it won't, Clara said firmly. And if somehow it does, you have my permission to hate me forever. They left the next morning before dawn. Mrs. Patterson had arrived the previous evening, clucking over the state of the cabin and Emma's worn clothes, but clearly softening when Emma showed her the rag doll and whispered something about its name. The wolf tracks led south and west, into rougher country where the pines grew thick and the ground turned rocky. Gideon moved slowly, teaching Caleb as they went, how to read broken branches, disturbed earth, scat that told you what the animals were eating and how recently they'd passed. Clara followed, quiet and attentive, her rifle carried properly like he'd shown her. By midday, they'd found the pack's general territory. By evening, they'd located a den site in a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow valley. 6 wolves, Gideon said quietly, studying the tracks. Maybe 7. All adults. How do you know they're adults? Caleb whispered. Paw size, depth of the tracks. Pups would be lighter, tracks closer together. Are we going to kill them all? The question was complicated. Gideon had killed plenty of animals in his life, for food, for pelts, for protection. But he'd never enjoyed it, never killed more than necessary. We're going to eliminate the threat, he said carefully. The ranchers need their livestock protected. But we'll do it clean, quick, no suffering. They made camp a quarter-mile downwind and waited for dark. The plan was simple. Locate the pack's kill site, set up in a position with clear sight lines, wait for them to return. Caleb fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's hiking. Gideon sat first watch while Clara rested. Around midnight, they switched. Clara took the rifle and positioned herself where she could see the approaches while Gideon tried to sleep. He woke to Clara's hand on his shoulder and her whispered voice in his ear. They're here. Gideon came fully awake instantly. In the moonlight, he could see shadows moving through the valley below, 6 wolves, just as he'd estimated, circling what looked like the remains of a calf they'd killed earlier. He took the rifle from Clara and sighted carefully. The pack's alpha was clear, larger than the others, more confident in its movements. Gideon had one chance to do this right. One shot to take down the leader and scatter the rest before they could organize. He exhaled slowly, found his target, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the valley like thunder. The alpha went down clean. The rest of the pack scattered instantly, vanishing into the darkness. Caleb jerked awake, eyes wild. What happened? Stay here, Gideon ordered. He handed the rifle to Clara. Keep him safe. I'm going to track the others. Like hell you are, Clara said. We do this together. It's too dangerous, which is exactly why you need someone watching your back. They argued in fierce whispers until Caleb interrupted. I'll stay here, by myself. I'm not a baby. Both adults looked at him. The boy's jaw was set, his eyes defiant. Absolutely not, Clara said. You said I could be useful. Let me be useful. I'll stay put, keep the fire going, watch for anything weird. You two go do what you need to do. Gideon saw the truth of it. They could argue all night, or they could trust the boy to handle a few hours alone. "You stay right here," he said. "You see or hear anything that scares you, you fire this pistol 3 times. He handed Caleb his revolver. "We'll come running." They left the boy by the fire and moved into the darkness together. Tracking wolves at night was dangerous and stupid, but the bounty required proof of the entire pack's elimination. Over the next 4 hours, Gideon and Clara worked methodically through the territory, finding and dispatching 4 more wolves. It was grim work, made harder by Clara's presence, not because she slowed him down, but because every time they found another animal, Gideon had to watch her face and see what this kind of killing cost her. By dawn, they were exhausted, covered in blood, and 2 wolves short of the full count. "The last 2 ran north," Gideon said. "Probably won't come back to this territory. Ranchers should be safe. But we won't get the full bounty." "No, maybe $70 instead of $100. Clara nodded tiredly. "It'll have to be enough." They returned to camp to find Caleb right where they'd left him, wide awake and gripping the pistol like his life depended on it. When he saw them, the tension drained out of him so fast he almost fell over. "You okay?" Clara asked. "Fine. You?" "Tired, but fine." They packed up camp and started the long walk home. Caleb peppered them with questions about the hunt, the wolves, what it felt like to take a life. Gideon answered honestly when he could, deflected when he couldn't. They reached town by late afternoon and went straight to the Ranchers Association to claim the bounty. The foreman inspected their proof, pelts from 5 wolves, including the alpha, and counted out $70. "You got the ones that were doing the most damage," he said. "That's worth something." With money in hand, they went to the general store. Clara shopped with ruthless efficiency, buying exactly what they needed and nothing they didn't. Plates, fabric, food supplies that would last through spring, seeds for planting, everything on her list and then some. The store owner watched this transaction with barely concealed curiosity. "Heard you 2 got married. That true?" "It is," Clara said, without looking up from the fabric she was examining. "And you're really living up at Rourke's place with those orphans?" "We are." "That's—" The owner struggled for words. "That's quite a change from the boarding house." "Yes, it is." Clara paid for everything, accepted no commentary, and walked out with her head high. They collected Emma from Mrs. Patterson, who'd clearly spent the entire time trying to convince the little girl that cabin life was unsuitable and she'd be better off in town. Emma's response, when they arrived, was to run straight to Clara and wrap her arms around her waist. That night, back at the cabin, they unpacked supplies while the children explored their new things like they'd been given treasure. Real plates, real cups, fabric that would become new clothes. "Look, Emma," Caleb said, holding up a tin of hard candy the store owner had thrown in as a bonus. "We can each have one." Emma took her piece carefully, studying it like she'd never seen sugar before. Maybe she hadn't, not in months anyway. Gideon watched this scene, these 2 children finding joy in simple things, Clara organizing their new supplies with satisfaction, the cabin finally starting to feel like a home instead of a survival shelter, and felt something dangerous bloom in his chest. Hope. Not the careful, guarded kind he'd allowed himself before. Real hope. The kind that hurt when you acknowledged it. Clara caught his expression. "What?" "Nothing, just thinking." "About?" "About how we might actually pull this off." Clara looked at the children, then back at him. "We'd better. Because I didn't track wolves through the dark just to have some judge decide we're not good enough." That night, after the children were asleep, after Clara had gone to bed, Gideon sat by the fire and thought about the family he'd somehow acquired, a wife he barely knew, 2 children who weren't his, a life he'd never planned for, 2 weeks until the judge arrived, 14 days to prove they were worth keeping together. It should have felt impossible. Instead, watching this firelight flicker across the cabin's new curtains, listening to 4 people breathing in the darkness, Gideon thought it might be the most possible thing he'd ever attempted. The next 12 days passed in a blur of work that left them all bone-tired and strangely content. Gideon worked on the addition from first light until his hands were too numb to hold tools, stopping only when Clara forced food into him or when exhaustion made continuing dangerous. The room took shape slowly, walls rising log by log, a roof frame that would keep out weather, a door frame that Caleb had helped measure 3 times to make sure it was square. Clara transformed the cabin's interior with ruthless efficiency. Curtains appeared in the window, blocking drafts and giving the place actual privacy. The floor got swept daily instead of whenever Gideon remembered. Meals became regular events instead of haphazard affairs eaten standing up. She even managed to make the rough furniture look intentional instead of cobbled together from whatever timber was handy. The children adapted in ways neither adult expected. Emma started talking more. Not a lot, but enough that they learned she was 6, not 4 like they'd thought, and that her favorite color was yellow, even though she'd never owned anything that color in her life. She followed Clara everywhere, learning how to cook and clean and mend, her small hands surprisingly capable when given tasks she could manage. Caleb remained wary but less hostile. He helped Gideon with the construction, holding boards steady while Gideon nailed them in place, learning the names of tools and techniques. The boy had good hands for the work, steady and careful. He asked endless questions but actually listened to the answers instead of just waiting to talk. By the 10th day, the addition had walls, a roof, and a door that actually closed. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. More importantly, it was separate, a space the children could call their own. "It needs beds," Clara said, studying the bare room. "I can build frames tomorrow," Gideon said. "We've got enough lumber left over. And mattresses. We can stuff them with pine needles and grass for now, replace them with proper ones when we have money again." They were standing in the new room together while the children explored outside. Through the open door, Gideon could see Caleb showing Emma how to skip stones in the creek that ran behind the cabin. "You think it's enough?" Gideon asked quietly. "For the judge?" "I think it shows we're trying, that we're invested. Whether it's enough depends on what kind of man Morrison is." Davies says he's fair. Strict, but fair. Fair to whose standards? Rich people's? Town people's? Or actual fair? Gideon didn't have an answer for that. Clara walked the perimeter of the room, checking the chinking between logs, testing the door's hinges. "We need to talk about what happens when he gets here." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we need our story straight. How we met, why we got married, what our plans are. He's going to ask questions, and our answers need to match. We tell him the truth. The truth makes us sound desperate and possibly insane. We are desperate and possibly insane." Clara almost smiled at that. "Fine, we tell him the truth, but we tell it carefully. We emphasize that this arrangement is about providing stability for the children, that we're committed to making it work long term." "We are." "Are we?" Clara turned to face him directly. "Because I need to know, Gideon. Are you in this for the next 6 months until the judge is satisfied, and then you'll find some way to dissolve the marriage? Or are you actually committed to this family we're building?" The question caught Gideon off guard. He'd been so focused on getting through the next 2 days that he hadn't thought much beyond the judge's visit. "I don't know how to be a husband," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a father. I'm making this up as I go and probably doing it wrong most of the time." "That's not what I asked." Gideon looked out at the children. Caleb had his arm around Emma's shoulders, guiding her hand through the motion of throwing a stone. The girl was laughing, actually laughing, bright and clear. "I'm committed," Gideon said, "to all of it, for as long as you'll have me." Clara studied his face like she was reading something written there. "All right then, we tell Morrison the truth, that we entered this marriage to protect the children, but that we're building something real, something that will last. And if he doesn't believe us, then we make him believe us." Judge Morrison arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, riding into Red Hollow in a coach that looked far too nice for the muddy excuse of a road it had traveled. He was a compact man in his 60s, well-dressed but not flashy, with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth set in a permanent expression of skepticism. Marshal Davies met him at the edge of town and escorted him to the office, where Gideon and Clara were already waiting. They'd left the children at the cabin with Mrs. Patterson. Morrison would interview them later, separately, but first he wanted to hear from the adults. "Mr. and Mrs. Rourke," Morrison said, settling into the chair behind Davies's desk like he owned it. "I've read the marshal's report. Quite an unusual situation." "Yes, sir," Gideon said. "You found these children 10 days before you got married. Is that correct?" 11 days, but yes, sir." Morrison made a note. "And Mrs. Rourke, you'd been living in Red Hollow for approximately 18 months before agreeing to marry a man you'd barely spoken to. Why?" Clara's spine straightened. Because 2 children needed a mother, and I was in a position to help. That's very charitable. But marriage is a significant commitment to undertake for strangers. They won't be strangers for long, perhaps. But your husband will be. You can't possibly know his character, his habits, whether he'll be a suitable provider and guardian. I know he found 2 freezing children in a blizzard and brought them home instead of leaving them to die. I know he rode into town and made himself vulnerable in front of the entire community because he was desperate to keep them safe. That tells me more about his character than 6 months of polite courtship would. Morrison's eyebrow raised slightly. You have strong opinions, Mrs. Rourke. I have informed opinions. There's a difference. The judge turned his attention to Gideon. And you, Mr. Rourke, you've lived alone for 19 years, no family, minimal contact with civilization. What made you think you were qualified to raise children? I didn't think I was qualified, Gideon said honestly. Still don't, but I was there and they needed help and nobody else was volunteering. So this is about convenience? They were convenient to save? No, sir. This is about them deserving a chance, deserving to stay together in a place where people actually care what happens to them instead of being shipped off to some institution where they're just numbers. Morrison leaned back in his chair. I've sent many children to those institutions, Mr. Rourke. Some of them have done quite well. And some of them haven't. Those odds aren't good enough for Caleb and Emma. You're quite certain of that? Yes, sir. The judge studied them both for a long moment. Tell me about your living situation. The marshal's report mentions a cabin 3 miles from town. They described the cabin, the new addition, the supplies they'd purchased. Morrison listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. And how do you plan to support 4 people on a trapper's income? He asked. I'll work harder, Gideon said. Trap more territory. Hunt for meat to sell in town. Whatever it takes. Mrs. Rourke, will you be contributing financially? I'll take in mending and washing when possible. Tend a garden come spring. Preserve food for winter. Make sure we're not wasting resources. Morrison nodded slowly. An education? The boy is what, 7 years old? 8, Clara corrected. And yes, I'll be teaching both children. Reading, writing, arithmetic. I was educated through 8th grade myself. That's more than most frontier children receive. Morrison closed his notebook and stood up. I'd like to see this cabin of yours and speak with the children privately. They rode out to the cabin together, Morrison in his coach, Gideon and Clara on Rust. The judge said little during the journey, just observed the trail, the forest, the increasing isolation. When the cabin came into view, Morrison studied it with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. The main structure with its smoking chimney, the new addition that was clearly recent construction, the small garden plot Clara had already started preparing even though planting season was weeks away. Mrs. Patterson emerged when they arrived, looking nervous. Judge Morrison, the children are inside. They've been very well behaved. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I'll speak with them shortly. Morrison walked the property first, examining the well, the woodpile, the smokehouse Gideon had built for preserving meat. He checked the cabin's construction, tested the door hinges, looked inside the children's new room. It's crude work, he observed, but solid, built to last. I'm better with timber than finishing work, Gideon admitted, but it'll keep them warm and dry, which is what matters. Morrison entered the main cabin. It was clean, Clara had made sure of that, but there was no hiding the basic nature of it. This was a working cabin, built for survival, not comfort. Emma and Caleb stood near the fire, both dressed in their new clothes, both trying hard to look brave. Mrs. Patterson had clearly coached them on proper behavior. Hello, Morrison said gently. His entire demeanor changed around the children, less formal, more approachable. You must be Caleb and Emma. Caleb nodded. Emma just stared. I'm Judge Morrison. I'm here to make sure you're being taken care of properly. Is it all right if I ask you some questions? Another nod from Caleb. Mr. and Mrs. Rourke, I'll need you to step outside while I speak with the children. Mrs. Patterson, you may stay. Gideon and Clara walked out into the cold. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Everything depended on what happened in the next half hour. Inside the cabin, Morrison pulled up a chair and sat down so he was closer to the children's eye level. Caleb, Emma, I want you to understand something. You can tell me the truth, even if you think it might get someone in trouble. My job is to make sure you're safe and happy. That's all I care about." "We're safe," Caleb said immediately. "I'm glad to hear that. Can you tell me what a typical day is like here?" Caleb described their routine: waking up, helping with chores, meals with Clara and Gideon, lessons in reading and writing, working on projects. Emma nodded along, occasionally whispering additions that Caleb translated. "Do you get enough to eat?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir. Clara's a good cook, way better than Gideon."
"Does either of them ever hurt you, hit you, or yell at you?" "No, sir. Gideon gets quiet when he's mad, but he doesn't yell. And Clara's never been mad at us, not really."
Morrison made notes. "What about school? Would you like to go to a real school in town instead of having lessons here?" Caleb's face shuddered. "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because then Emma and I would be apart during the day. And because the kids in town already think we're strange. It's easier here." "Strange how?"
"Orphans."
"Living with the scary mountain man. Having a mother who appeared out of nowhere." Caleb's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was describing the weather. "People talk. We hear them." Morrison's expression softened. "That must be difficult." "It's fine. We don't need those people anyway." "What about friends? Don't you want friends your own age?" "I have Emma. She's enough." The judge turned his attention to the little girl. "Emma, can you tell me something? Do you feel safe here?" Emma nodded vigorously. "Are you happy?" The girl thought about that for a moment, then whispered something to Caleb. "She says she's not happy like before, when Mama and Papa were alive. But she's not scared anymore. And Clara sings to her at night, which helps." Morrison wrote this down carefully. "One more question for both of you. If you could choose where to live, here with the Rourkes, or somewhere else with different people, what would you choose?" "Here," Caleb said immediately. "We choose here." Emma wrapped her arms around her brother and nodded against his shoulder. Morrison studied them for a long moment, then closed his notebook. "Thank you for being honest with me. You can go play outside now if you'd like." The children didn't need to be told twice. They disappeared through the door, leaving Morrison alone with Mrs. Patterson. "Off the record, Martha," Morrison said quietly. "Your honest assessment. Are those children being well cared for?" Mrs. Patterson pursed her lips. "I think Clara Whitmore lost her mind when she married that man. I think they're playing house with two traumatized children and the whole thing could fall apart at any moment." "That's not what I asked." The boarding house owner sighed. "But yes, they're being well cared for. I've checked on them 3 times since the wedding. The children are clean, fed, properly clothed. They're learning their letters. They're not being mistreated. And," she paused, clearly struggling with the admission, "and they're attached, genuinely attached. Emma calls Clara Mama when she thinks nobody's listening. Caleb watches Gideon like he's trying to memorize how to be a man." Morrison nodded slowly. "Thank you. That's what I needed to know." Outside, Gideon and Clara waited in silence. The children had found them and were playing nearby. Caleb demonstrating the proper way to stack firewood while Emma watched with solemn attention. The cabin door opened. Morrison stepped out, followed by Mrs. Patterson. "Mr. and Mrs. Rourke," the judge said. "Walk with me." They followed him away from the cabin, out of the children's earshot. Morrison stopped near the creek and turned to face them. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, he said. "I've placed hundreds of children in homes, institutions, with relatives. I've seen every variation of family you can imagine." He paused. "This situation is unusual, I'll grant you that. A marriage of convenience undertaken specifically to maintain custody. In most cases, I'd be skeptical." Gideon's stomach tightened. "But," Morrison continued, "I'm not most cases. I'm this case. And in this case, I see 2 children who've experienced terrible loss and found stability with 2 adults who are genuinely trying to do right by them." He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Rourke, you've given up a comfortable life in town to live in isolation and poverty. Why?" "Because comfort isn't the same as purpose," Clara said. "I was comfortable at the boarding house. But I wasn't useful, wasn't needed. Those children need me. And you, Mr. Rourke, you could have reported finding them and walked away clean. Let the system handle it. Why didn't you?" Gideon chose his words carefully. "Because I know what the system does to kids like them. It splits them up, ships them off, forgets about them. Caleb and Emma have already lost everything. They deserve to at least keep each other." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play by the woodpile. I'm granting you temporary custody, he said finally. 6 months. During that time, you'll maintain this home, provide education and proper care, and demonstrate that this arrangement is sustainable long term. I'll return in October to reassess. Relief hit Gideon so hard he nearly staggered. Clara's hand found his, squeezed tight. However, Morrison continued, and the relief evaporated instantly. I'm placing conditions. First, the children will be examined by a doctor in town every 2 months. I want medical documentation that they're healthy and thriving. Second, you'll bring them to Red Hollow at least twice monthly for socialization. I don't want them growing up completely isolated. Third, if at any point I receive credible reports of neglect or abuse, I will remove them immediately. No warnings, no second chances. Understood? Yes, sir, they said in unison. Good. I'll file the paperwork today. You'll receive official documentation within the week. Morrison pulled on his gloves, preparing to leave. One more thing. This marriage, I'm listing it as legitimate in my report, not as a convenience. That means you're bound by it legally and socially. If you choose to dissolve it later, it will reflect poorly on any future custody arrangements. We understand, Clara said. Morrison nodded. Then I'll see you in October. Don't make me regret this decision. He walked back toward his coach, leaving Gideon and Clara standing by the creek. We did it, Clara whispered. 6 months. That's not permanent. It's enough time to prove we're serious, enough time to make this real. Gideon looked at her. This woman who'd married him based on one question, who'd hunted wolves in the dark and transformed his cabin into a home, who'd stood in front of a judge and defended their impossible family with absolute conviction. Clara? Yes? Thank you. She squeezed his hand again. Don't thank me yet. We've still got 6 months to survive. They told the children together that night, after Morrison had left and Mrs. Patterson had returned to town. Caleb and Emma sat on their new beds in their new room while Gideon and Clara explained what the judge had decided. So we can stay? Caleb asked, like he was afraid to believe it. You can stay, Clara confirmed, for at least 6 months. And if everything goes well, permanently. What does permanently mean? It means forever, Gideon said. It means you'd be our children legally, officially. Emma's eyes went wide. Forever? If you want that. If we can prove to the judge that we're taking good care of you and that you're happy here. Caleb looked at his sister, then at the adults. What if we mess up? What if we're bad and he changes his mind? You're not bad, Clara said firmly, and you won't mess this up. We're in this together, all 4 of us. If there are problems, we solve them as a family. The boy still looked uncertain, like the ground might disappear beneath him at any moment. Caleb, Gideon said quietly, I know it's hard to trust this. Hard to believe it'll last. But I need you to try. Can you do that? I don't know how. One day at a time. That's all any of us can do. That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Gideon sat by the fire and tried to process what had happened. 6 months of temporary custody. 6 months to prove they could make this work. Clara emerged from the children's room and sat down beside him. Emma asked me something tonight, she said quietly. What? She asked if I was going to leave like her mother did. Gideon felt his chest tighten. What did you tell her? That her mother didn't leave on purpose. That death took her, and death isn't a choice. Clara stared into the fire. Then she asked if death was going to take me too. What did you say to that? The truth. That I don't know. That I'll try my hardest to stay alive and keep taking care of her, but I can't promise forever because nobody can. How'd she take it? Better than I expected. She's already learned that adults can't protect her from everything. At least I was honest. Clara looked at Gideon. She asked about you too, asked if you were going to leave. I'm not. That's what I told her. But Gideon, you need to understand what you're promising. Those children have already been abandoned once. If you decide 6 months from now that this isn't what you want, I won't. You can't know that. Yes, I can. Gideon turned to face her fully. I'm not good at a lot of things. I don't know how to talk pretty or make people comfortable or fit into normal society, but I know how to keep a promise. And I promised those kids a home. I meant it. Clara studied his face in the firelight. All right, Then we do this properly. No half measures. We build a real family, not just a performance for the judge. Agreed. Which means we need to figure out how to actually live together, how to make decisions together, how to be partners instead of just two people occupying the same space. Gideon hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I. My marriage to Daniel was... She paused, searching for words. It was traditional. He made the decisions. I ran the household. We didn't really talk about being partners. So we're both making this up. Seems like. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down. We should probably establish some rules, Clara said eventually, about how this household runs. Like what? Like big decisions get discussed together. Like we don't undermine each other in front of the children. Like we're honest about problems before they become disasters. That sounds reasonable? And we check in with each other, not every day necessarily, but regularly. Make sure we're both handling this all right. Gideon nodded. What else? Clara looked at him, her expression serious. We give each other permission to be human, to make mistakes, to have bad days. This doesn't have to be perfect to be good enough. I can do that. Can you? Because you've been working yourself into the ground for 2 weeks straight, building that room, hunting for food, trying to do everything yourself. That's not sustainable. I'm fine. You're exhausted and stubborn and probably doing permanent damage to your back. Clara's voice softened. I married you to help with the children, Gideon. Let me actually help. Stop trying to carry everything alone. The words hit harder than they should have. Gideon had spent 19 years being self-sufficient, relying on nobody, accepting no help. The idea of letting someone else share the burden felt foreign and slightly dangerous. But Clara was right. He couldn't do this alone. Couldn't keep this family together through sheer force of will. All right, he said finally. I'll try. That's all I'm asking. 3 days later, disaster struck in the form of a late-season blizzard that rolled down from the high country without warning. It hit just after dawn, turning the world white in minutes. By midday, snow was piling up against the cabin walls faster than Gideon could shovel it away. We need to get the animals inside, he told Clara. Rust and the chickens we bought last week. They'll freeze if we leave them out. What about firewood? We're going to burn through our supply fast in this cold. I'll bring in as much as I can before it gets buried. They worked frantically for the next 2 hours, moving animals into the small lean-to attached to the cabin, hauling firewood inside until the main room was half full of stacked logs, securing everything that might blow away. The children helped where they could, Emma feeding the chickens, Caleb helping stack wood. Both were frightened but trying not to show it. By evening, the storm was at full strength. Wind screamed around the cabin. Snow drove horizontally. The temperature dropped so fast that water froze in cups. They huddled around the fire, all 4 of them, rationing the food Clara had prepared. The cabin shook with each gust of wind. Drafts found every crack in the chinking. How long do these usually last? Clara asked. Day or 2, sometimes 3, Gideon said. This one feels big, though. Emma pressed closer to Clara. I'm scared. I know, sweetheart, but we're safe inside. The cabin's strong. A particularly violent gust hit the building, and something in the roof cracked loud enough to hear over the wind. Everyone looked up. What was that? Caleb asked. Gideon was already moving. He grabbed a lantern and climbed up to check the roof supports. One of the main beams had split, not broken completely, but damaged enough to be dangerous. He climbed back down, his face grim. We've got a problem. How bad? Clara asked. Bad enough. That beam's holding up half the roof. If it goes completely, the whole thing could collapse. Can you fix it? Not in this storm. Best I can do is brace it from below, try to take some of the weight off until the weather clears. They spent the next hour rigging support posts under the damaged beam, using everything they had, spare lumber, the table legs, even one of the new bed frames from the children's room. It was ugly and makeshift, but it held. That night nobody slept much. The storm raged on, relentless. The cabin groaned and shifted. The fire had to be constantly tended to keep from going out. Around midnight, Emma started crying, quietly at first, then harder when she couldn't stop herself. Clara gathered the girl into her lap, rocking her gently. It's all right. We're safe, I promise. Mama said that too, Emma sobbed, before she died. The words landed like stones. Clara's arms tightened around the child.
Your mama did her best, Clara said softly. She tried to keep you safe. Sometimes trying isn't enough, and that's not anyone's fault. But we're here now, and we're going to keep trying, all of us together. Caleb had gone very quiet, his face pale in the firelight. Gideon saw the boy's hands shaking. Caleb, Gideon said, come here. The boy didn't move. Please.
Slowly, reluctantly, Caleb stood and crossed to where Gideon sat. Gideon put an arm around the boy's shoulders, half expecting him to pull away. Instead, Caleb leaned in, his whole body trembling. I'm scared, the boy whispered. Me too. Really? Really. This is the worst storm I've seen in 5 years, but we're going to get through it. How do you know? Because I've gotten through worse, and because we're prepared, and because we have each other now, which makes a difference. They sat like that for a long time, Clara holding Emma, Gideon with his arm around Caleb, all of them listening to the storm destroy the world outside while the cabin held firm around them. The blizzard lasted 4 days. By the time it finally broke, they were down to their last day of firewood and running low on food. The cabin had held, but just barely. Snow had found its way inside through cracks they didn't know existed. The damaged beam was hanging on by splinters, and everyone was exhausted from 4 days of constant stress. When Gideon finally pushed open the door, he found the world transformed. Snow came up to his waist. Trees had fallen everywhere. The lean-to where they'd sheltered the animals had partially collapsed. How bad is it? Clara asked from inside. Bad. We'll need to dig out before we can do anything else. It took them 2 full days to recover from the storm, digging paths, repairing damage, checking on the animals. Rust had survived, along with most of the chickens. The lean-to needed complete reconstruction. Through it all, something had shifted between the 4 of them. The storm had forced them to trust each other in ways nothing else could have. Emma had stopped being quite so careful around Gideon. Caleb had started asking for help instead of trying to do everything himself. Clara and Gideon had learned to work together without words, anticipating each other's needs. They were becoming a family. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but genuinely. 1 week after the storm, Caleb approached Gideon while he was repairing the lean-to.
Can I ask you something? The boy said. Sure. When you were fixing the roof during the storm, were you really scared? Yes. But you did it anyway. Had to. Cabin would have collapsed otherwise. Caleb thought about that. How do you know when you have to do something even though you're scared? When not doing it would hurt people you care about.
The boy nodded slowly. Then, in a voice so quiet Gideon almost missed it, I'm glad we stayed. With you and Clara. Me too, son. The word slipped out before Gideon could stop it. He froze, expecting Caleb to object, to remind him they weren't actually father and son. Instead, the boy just smiled and went back to handing Gideon nails. That night, as they sat around the fire after the children had gone to bed, Clara asked Gideon a question. Were you kind today? Gideon looked at her, surprised. What? It's something I need to ask, not just today, but every day. Were you kind to them? He thought about it, about helping Emma learn her letters even though he was exhausted, about listening to Caleb's endless questions without getting impatient, about the 100 small moments that made up a day of caring for children. I tried, he said. Clara nodded, satisfied. Then we're doing all right. It became their ritual. Every night before sleep, Clara asked the same question, and every night Gideon gave the same answer. I tried. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And in the end, that was all they had, 4 imperfect people trying their best to build something worth keeping. Spring arrived slowly that year, like it was testing whether the world was ready for it. Snow melted in patches, revealing dead grass and mud that sucked at boots. The creek swelled with runoff. Birds returned to the pines, filling the mornings with sound Gideon had stopped noticing years ago, but now heard again through Emma's delighted reactions. The 6 months stretched ahead of them like a promise and a threat. They fell into rhythms that felt almost normal: breakfast before dawn, chores divided according to ability, lessons for the children in the afternoon, evenings around the fire. But underneath it all ran a current of uncertainty. October and Judge Morrison's return loomed over everything. Clara planted the garden with Emma's help, teaching the girl the names of seeds and how deep to bury them. Caleb worked alongside Gideon, learning to trap and hunt and read the forest. They were building skills, building knowledge, building a life that looked sustainable from the outside. Whether it actually was remained to be seen. In late April, trouble arrived in the form of a traveling preacher who stopped in Red Hollow and heard about the mountain man's unusual marriage. Reverend Porter was the kind of man who measured righteousness by how loudly he could condemn sin, and he decided that Clara and Gideon's arrangement was an affront to everything holy. He showed up at the cabin on a Tuesday morning, uninvited and unwelcome. "Mr. Rourke," he announced, dismounting from his horse like he owned the place. "I've come to discuss the state of your soul and your mockery of holy matrimony." Gideon had been splitting wood. He set down the axe carefully and wiped sweat from his face. "Not interested in discussing either one. Your marriage is a sham. Everyone knows it. You wed this woman under false pretenses to keep children that aren't yours. The marriage is legal. The children are in our custody. That's all that matters." Porter's face reddened. "What matters is that you're living in sin, corrupting these innocent children with your deception." Clara appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression was dangerous. "Reverend Porter, is it? I suggest you get back on your horse and leave. I will not stand by while—" "You're not standing by anything. You're trespassing. This is our property, our family, and none of your business." "Everything is the business of those who serve the light. Your arrangement, our arrangement," Clara interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut, "is that we're caring for 2 orphaned children who would otherwise have nothing. We're feeding them, clothing them, teaching them, keeping them safe." "What exactly about that offends you?" Porter sputtered. "The deception, the false marriage, the marriage is real. We stood before a marshal and made vows. We signed legal documents. We live as husband and wife in the eyes of the law and this community. But not in truth. Everyone knows you married him to keep those children, not out of love or proper—" Clara stepped down from the cabin porch, and something in her movement made Porter take a step back. "Let me tell you about truth, Reverend," she said quietly. "The truth is that I buried my husband and son 5 years ago. The truth is that I spent those 5 years existing but not living. The truth is that when Gideon Rourke stood in that saloon and asked for help saving 2 children, he showed more courage and decency than any man I'd met since Daniel died." She moved closer, and Porter actually backed up another step. "The truth is that we're building something real here, something that matters. And if you think love only counts when it starts with romance and flowers, then you don't know a damn thing about what makes a family. I won't listen to such language from a woman." "Then leave." Clara pointed toward the trail. "Because I'm not finished. You want to talk about sin? Let's talk about the sin of standing in judgment of people you don't know. The sin of trying to destroy something good because it doesn't fit your narrow definition of proper. The sin of caring more about appearances than about whether children are safe and loved." Caleb and Emma had appeared in the doorway, watching this confrontation with wide eyes. Porter noticed them and seemed to find new ammunition. "Those children deserve a proper Christian home, not this charade." That's when Gideon moved. He didn't touch Porter, didn't threaten him, just stepped between the preacher and his family with the kind of quiet finality that made smart people nervous. "Time for you to go," Gideon said. "I'll be reporting this to Judge Morrison. He needs to know." "Report whatever you want. The judge has already seen our home, interviewed the children, made his decision. Your opinion doesn't change that." Porter looked between Gideon and Clara, seemed to realize he was outmatched, and climbed back onto his horse with as much dignity as he could salvage. "You'll regret this," he said. "All of you." "We've already survived worse than you," Claire replied. "I think we'll manage." They watched him ride away, his back stiff with righteous indignation. When he was out of sight, Clara sagged slightly against the porch railing. "That was something," Gideon said. "That was exhausting. I hate men like him." "You did good, though. Better than good." Clara looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Respect. The acknowledgement that they'd just defended their family together and won. "Mama?" Emma called from the doorway. "Are we in trouble?" Clara's face transformed. It was the first time Emma had called her that out loud, in front of everyone. She crossed to the girl and knelt down. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. That man was just confused about what matters." "What does matter?" "This." Clara gestured to encompass the cabin, the garden, all of them. "Family, taking care of each other, being kind even when the world isn't kind back." Emma thought about that, then nodded seriously and went back inside. Caleb lingered in his doorway, his expression troubled. Is he going to make the judge take us away? No, Gideon said firmly. Morrison's smarter than that. He judges us on what he sees, not what some preacher thinks he knows. But what if... Caleb! Gideon waited until the boy looked at him. Stop borrowing trouble. We've got enough real problems without inventing more. The boy nodded reluctantly and followed his sister inside. Clara looked at Gideon.
Do you really think Morrison won't listen to him? I think Morrison made his decision based on facts. One angry preacher doesn't change facts. I hope you're right. So do I. But Porter's visit had shaken something loose. That night, after the children were asleep, Claire and Gideon had the conversation they'd been avoiding for months. We need to talk about what happens in October, Clara said. Gideon added wood to the fire, not looking at her. Morrison reviews the situation, decides if we're doing right by the kids. And if he decides we are, what then? Then we keep doing what we're doing. For how long? As long as it takes. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's not an answer. That's an evasion. Gideon finally turned to face her. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me what you actually want, not what you think you're supposed to want, not what's best for the children. What do you want from this marriage? The question caught Gideon completely off guard. Nobody had asked him what he wanted in longer than he could remember. I don't know, he admitted. Try. He struggled for words, for honesty. I want the kids to stay. I want them to be safe and happy and have a real childhood. I want to watch them grow up and know I helped make that possible. That's what you want for them. What about for us? Clara, what do you want from me, Gideon, from this marriage? Because I need to know if we're pretending until October or actually building something. Gideon looked at her, this fierce, complicated woman who'd upended his entire life and somehow made it better. I don't know how to build it. I've never done this before. Neither have I. Not like this. Clara moved closer. But I need to know if you're willing to try. Really try. Because I can keep doing this as partners raising children together. That's fine. That's what we agreed to. But if there's a chance of more, if you want more, then we should probably talk about it before October gets here and we're locked into whatever we've become by then. Do you want more? Clara laughed, but it sounded sad. That's a complicated question. I love Daniel. I still love him in some ways, but he's gone. And I'm here, and you're... She paused, searching for words. You're nothing like him. You're quiet where he was loud, careful where he was reckless. You think before you speak and you mean what you say, and you've never once tried to be anything other than exactly who you are. That doesn't sound like a compliment? It's the highest compliment I can give. You're real, Gideon, in a world full of people performing who they think they should be. You're just yourself, and I respect that more than I can say. Gideon didn't know what to do with that information. So what are you saying? I'm saying I could fall in love with you. Maybe I already am, a little, but I need to know if that's something you want before I let myself feel it all the way. The honesty in her voice was almost painful. Gideon thought about the last 6 months, about waking up every morning knowing someone else was in his cabin, in his life, about the way Clara sang to Emma at night, about how she challenged him when he was being stubborn and supported him when he was struggling, about the feeling of not being alone anymore. I'm not good at this, he said quietly. I don't know how to be romantic or say the right things or make you feel special. I don't need romance. I need partnership, honesty, someone who shows up every day and tries. I can do that. Is that what you want, though? Or are you just agreeing because you think it's what I need to hear? Gideon crossed the space between them and took her hands. They were rough from work, scarred from garden thorns, strong. I want you to stay, he said. Not because of the children, though they need you. Not because of the judge, though that matters. I want you to stay because this cabin was a survival shelter before you got here, and now it's a home. Because I was alone for 19 years, and I didn't realize how much that was killing me until you showed up and made me part of something bigger. Clara's eyes were bright. That's the most you've said at once since I met you. I know, it's uncomfortable. She laughed, a real laugh this time, and squeezed his hands. We're a mess, aren't we?
Two broken people trying to raise broken children in a cabin that's falling apart. Probably. But we're doing it anyway. We are. Clara leaned forward and kissed him, not the awkward peck from their wedding, but something real, something that promised possibility. When she pulled back, she was smiling. All right then, she said. Let's build something that lasts. The summer passed in a blur of work and growth. The garden flourished under Clara's care, providing food they'd never have been able to afford otherwise. Gideon's trapping brought in enough money to buy necessities. The children grew visibly stronger, healthier, more confident. But it wasn't easy. Emma had nightmares that left her screaming for her mother. Caleb went through phases of testing boundaries, pushing to see if Gideon and Clara would give up on him. Money was always tight. The cabin needed constant repairs. There were days when everyone was exhausted and frustrated and snapping at each other. Yet somehow, they made it work. When Emma had nightmares, Clara held her until she fell back asleep. When Caleb acted out, Gideon sat with him until the boy was ready to talk about what was really wrong. When money was short, they made do. When the cabin leaked, they fixed it together. They learned each other's rhythms, learned that Clara needed quiet in the mornings before she could face the day, that Gideon processed things by working with his hands, that Emma expressed herself better through drawings than words, that Caleb needed physical activity when his thoughts got too loud. In July, a wildfire broke out in the valley south of Red Hollow. It started small, a lightning strike in dry timber, but spread fast, driven by wind and drought. By the second day, smoke was visible from the cabin. By the third, people were evacuating. Marshal Davies rode out to warn them. Fires moving north could reach town by tomorrow if the wind doesn't change. What do you need? Gideon asked. Every able body we can get. We're digging fire breaks, moving livestock, evacuating families. I'll come. Me too, Claire said. Davies looked at the children. What about them? They come with us, Claire said firmly. We're not leaving them alone out here. They rode into Red Hollow together and found chaos. People were loading wagons with whatever possessions they could carry. The general store was handing out shovels and buckets. Someone had organized the women in the church to prepare food for the fighters. Gideon joined the men digging fire breaks. Back-breaking work that involved clearing every scrap of vegetation in a wide line to stop the fire's advance. Clara organized the evacuation effort, her natural efficiency making her a leader whether she wanted to be or not. She coordinated which families went where, who needed wagons, who had extra room. Emma and Caleb worked alongside the other children, filling buckets with water from the creek, bringing food and water to the exhausted workers, running messages between different groups. The fire reached the edge of town just after dawn on the fourth day. Gideon was part of the line holding the fire break on the eastern approach. 50 men with shovels and wet blankets, beating back flames that jumped the break in places. It was the kind of dangerous that made you stop thinking and just react. Gideon worked until his hands bled, his lungs burned, his vision narrowed to the next flame, the next spot that needed a shovel. Somewhere around midday, he realized Clara was on the line too, farther down, working alongside the men without hesitation. When the flames jumped the break near her position, she was the first one there with a blanket, smothering it before it could spread. They worked for 18 hours straight. By the time the wind finally shifted and rain started to fall, most of the town was saved. A few buildings on the outskirts were lost, and a lot of rangeland was burned, but Red Hollow itself survived. Gideon found Clara sitting on the church steps, covered in ash and soot, so exhausted she could barely hold her head up. He sat down beside her. "Hell of a day," he said. "Hell of a day," she agreed. "You were amazing out there." "So were you." They sat in silence, watching the rain fall on the smoldering landscape. Around them, the town was slowly coming back to life. People checking on neighbors, assessing damage, starting to rebuild. Caleb and Emma appeared, both filthy and exhausted, but unharmed. Emma climbed into Claire's lap without asking permission. Caleb sat down next to Gideon, leaning against his shoulder. "Is it over?" the boy asked. "It's over." "Did we win?" Gideon looked at the town, damaged but standing, its people tired but together. "Yeah, we won." Over the next few weeks, something changed in how Red Hollow looked at the Rourke family. The people who'd laughed when Gideon asked for a wife now nodded respectfully when he came to town. The women who'd clutched their children away from him now asked Clara for advice on gardening and preserving food. The children who'd avoided Caleb and Emma now invited them to play. It wasn't complete acceptance. Some people would always see them as strange, always question the validity of their marriage. But enough people had watched them fight for the town, had seen them work side by side with everyone else, that the worst of the judgment faded. Mrs. Patterson was the first to acknowledge it directly. She stopped by the cabin in August with a basket of preserves. "I was wrong about you," she told Clara bluntly, "about this whole situation. I thought you were throwing your life away on a man you didn't know, and children you didn't owe anything to." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now I think you're the smartest woman I know. You saw something worth saving and you saved it. That takes courage I don't have." Clara accepted the preserves and the apology with equal grace. "It takes desperation, more than courage. But thank you." After Mrs. Patterson left, Emma asked Clara what the woman had meant. "She meant that sometimes the best things in life don't look like what people expect them to look like," Clara said. "People thought I was crazy for marrying Gideon, but I wasn't crazy. I was choosing to build something real instead of settling for something safe." "Was Papa safe?" Emma asked. It was the first time the girl had asked about her father directly. Clara chose her words carefully. "I'm sure he was trying to be. But sometimes life doesn't give people a choice. He got sick, and sickness doesn't care about safe or dangerous." "Do you think he'd be mad that we're here with you instead of with him?" Clara pulled Emma close. "I think he'd want you to be happy, to be loved, to have a life. And if this is where you find that, then no, I don't think he'd be mad." September arrived with cooler weather and the knowledge that October was coming fast. Judge Morrison would return in 4 weeks to make his final decision about permanent custody. The pressure of it sat on all of them. Gideon found himself second-guessing every decision. Was he being too strict? Too lenient? Was the cabin good enough? Were the children learning enough? Clara dealt with it by cleaning everything in sight and making lists of things that still needed improvement. The children felt it too. Caleb went quiet, watching the adults with worried eyes. Emma started having nightmares again. One night, 2 weeks before Morrison was due, Caleb asked the question they had all been avoiding. "What happens if the judge says no? If he decides we can't stay?" Gideon and Clara looked at each other across the dinner table. "Then we appeal his decision," Clara said. "We fight it. We don't give up." "But what if we lose? What if they send us away anyway?" Gideon set down his fork and looked at the boy directly. "Caleb, I need you to understand something. We are not giving up on you. Not for a judge, not for the law, not for anything. If Morrison says you have to leave, we'll find another way. We'll move to a different territory if we have to. We'll do whatever it takes." "Really? Really? You and Emma are our children. That's not something a judge can change no matter what he decides." Caleb's eyes filled with tears he was trying hard not to shed. "I'm scared." "Me too," Gideon admitted. "But we're scared together. That makes a difference." Emma climbed out of her chair and wrapped her arms around Gideon's neck. "I don't want to leave. I want to stay here, with you and Mama." Something cracked open in Gideon's chest. He held the little girl carefully, like she was made of glass, and felt Clara's hand find his shoulder. "Then we'll make sure you can stay," he promised. Judge Morrison arrived on October 15th, exactly 6 months after his first visit. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes were still sharp. This time he came alone, without his coach, riding a simple horse. He spent the first day walking the property, examining everything. He checked the garden, now harvested and prepared for winter. He inspected the children's room, which had real beds now and a window with actual glass. He watched the family interact over dinner, noting the easy way they moved around each other. The second day, he interviewed each of them separately. He started with Emma. "Do you remember me?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I need to ask you some questions. Is that all right?" Another nod. "Are you happy here?" "Yes." "Do Gideon and Clara treat you well?" "Yes, they're my mama and papa now." Morrison made a note. "What do you mean by that?" "They take care of me. Mama sings to me when I'm sad. Papa lets me help with things, even when I'm not very good at them. They love me." "How do you know they love you?" Emma thought about this seriously. "Because they try hard. every day, even when they're tired or when I'm being difficult. They keep trying. The judge's expression softened slightly. That's a very wise observation. What about your brother? Is Caleb happy here too? I think so. He doesn't have nightmares as much anymore. And he laughs sometimes now. He didn't laugh before. Morrison talked to Emma for another 20 minutes, asking about her daily routine, her education, whether she felt safe. Her answers were simple but honest. Next came Caleb. The boy sat across from Morrison with squared shoulders and a defiant expression. I remember you, Caleb said before the judge could speak. You're here to decide if we're good enough to keep. Actually, I'm here to decide if your guardians are providing adequate care. They are. Tell me why you think that. Caleb's jaw tightened. Because 6 months ago, Emma and I were dying in a wagon. We'd lost our parents. We had nothing. Gideon found us and brought us home and kept us alive. Then Clara married him so we could stay together. They didn't have to do any of that. But they did. That's what happened initially. What about now? Are you still just surviving, or are you living? The distinction seemed to surprise Caleb. Living, I guess. I go fishing with Gideon. I help Mama in the garden. Emma and I have our own room. We learn things. We have enough food. He searched for the word. We're okay. Just okay? Better than okay. But I don't want to say we're perfect because then you might think we're lying. Morrison almost smiled at that. Fair enough. Let me ask you something else. If you could choose any family to live with, anywhere, anyone, would you still choose this one? Caleb didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? Because they're ours, and we're theirs. That matters more than anything else. Clara's interview was more confrontational. Morrison started with practical questions, finances, education plans, long-term sustainability, then moved to harder territory. Mrs. Rourke, be honest with me. Is this marriage real, or is it still just a legal arrangement? Clara met his eyes steadily. It's real. When did it become real? I don't know exactly. Sometime between hunting wolves together and rebuilding after that blizzard. Sometime between the first night Emma called me Mama and the day Gideon told me he wanted me to stay, not because of the children, but because he wanted me. It wasn't one moment. It was 100 small moments that added up to something I didn't expect. Do you love him? Yes. Does he love you? You'd have to ask him, but I think so. He's not good with words, but he shows it in other ways. Morrison made notes. And if I were to grant permanent custody, what happens 5 years from now? 10 years? Will you still be here, or will this family fall apart the moment the legal pressure is gone? I can't promise we'll never have problems. Can't promise we'll never struggle or fight or question our choices. But I can promise we'll keep trying, because that's what family is. Choosing to keep trying even when it's hard. Finally, Morrison interviewed Gideon. They sat outside, away from the cabin, while Gideon sharpened an axe blade and the judge asked questions. You've changed, Morrison observed. 6 months ago, you could barely look me in the eye. Now you seem settled, more certain. Having people depending on you does that. Or breaks you. I've seen it go both ways. Gideon tested the blade's edge, found it satisfactory. What do you want to know? I want to know if this is sustainable. If you can actually provide for a family of 4 on a trapper's income in the middle of nowhere. We made it through 6 months. We'll make it through the next 6. And the ones after that. How? Same way we've been doing it. Work hard. Waste nothing. Support each other. It's not complicated. Morrison was quiet for a moment. What about Clara? Are you being fair to her? She gave up a comfortable life in town for this. She's isolated here. Alone most of the day. Working harder than she ever had to at the boarding house. You should ask her if she feels I'm being unfair. I did. She says she's happy, but people say that sometimes when they're not. Gideon set down the axe and looked at Morrison directly. Clara is the strongest person I've ever met. If she was unhappy, she'd tell me, probably loudly. She doesn't pretend things are fine when they're not. It's one of the things I love about her. So you love her? Yes. Did you love her 6 months ago when you married her? No. But I respected her, and respect turned into trust, and trust turned into partnership, and somewhere in there I realized I couldn't imagine doing this without her. That's love, isn't it? Needing someone not because you're weak, but because they make you stronger? Morrison studied him. That's a better definition than most people manage. I'm not most people. No, you're not. The judge stood up, brushing dirt from his pants. I'll have my decision tomorrow. That night, nobody slept much. They sat around the fire, the four of them, not talking much, but taking comfort in proximity. Emma fell asleep against Clara's shoulder. Caleb dozed with his head on the table. Around midnight, Clara asked Gideon the question she asked every night. Were you kind today? Gideon looked at the children, at this family they'd built from desperation and determination. I tried, Clara smiled. Then whatever happens tomorrow, we did our best. Morrison announced his decision at midday, standing in the cabin with all four of them present. I've reviewed the evidence, he said formally, interviewed all parties, examined the living situation, considered the law and the circumstances. He paused, and the silence was excruciating. I'm granting permanent custody of Caleb and Emma to Gideon and Clara Rourke, with full parental rights and responsibilities. The words took a moment to register. When they did, Emma burst into tears. Caleb made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Clara's hand found Gideon's and squeezed so hard it hurt. Permanent? Gideon asked, needing to be sure. Permanent. Barring extreme circumstances, these children are yours. Legally, officially, permanently yours. Morrison's stern expression softened slightly. You've done well by them. Better than I expected, honestly. They're healthy, educated, clearly loved. The marriage appears genuine. The home, while modest, is adequate. I have no grounds to deny this petition. He produced papers from his bag and set them on the table. These are the adoption documents. Sign them, and Caleb and Emma become your children in every legal sense. They'll take your surname. You'll have full authority over their welfare. Gideon stared at the papers like they might disappear if he looked away. Clara was already reading through them, her lawyer's daughter upbringing showing in how carefully she checked every clause. It's legitimate, she said quietly. This makes it real. They signed together, their hands shaking slightly. Morrison witnessed the signatures, then handed them their copy. Congratulations, he said. You're officially a family. After Morrison left, after the initial shock wore off, after Emma had cried herself out and Caleb had stopped asking if it was really real, they sat together in the cabin and tried to process what had just happened. We're keeping you, Clara said wonderingly. We actually get to keep you. Forever? Emma asked. Forever. The girl climbed into Clara's lap and stayed there. Caleb looked at Gideon. Does this mean, can we call you Papa? Out loud, not just in our heads. Gideon's throat was too tight to speak. He just nodded. Papa, Caleb said, testing it out. Then louder, grinning. Papa. Something that had been locked inside Gideon for 19 years finally broke open. He pulled the boy into a rough hug, not caring that he was crying, not caring about anything except this moment. Clara was crying too, holding Emma and watching her husband, her real husband, embrace the son they'd fought so hard to keep. We did it, she whispered. We did. That night they celebrated with the best meal they could manage. Venison stew, fresh bread, the last of summer's preserves. Emma insisted on using the real plates. Caleb helped Clara cook, chattering the whole time about what they should do now that they were a real family. After the children were in bed, Gideon and Clara sat by the fire. I can't believe it's real, Clara said. Neither can I. We have children, Gideon, actual children who are ours to raise and protect and love. Terrifying, isn't it? Clara laughed. Absolutely terrifying, and wonderful, and completely insane. Gideon pulled her close, and she leaned against him with a trust that still amazed him. Were you kind today? Clara asked. I tried. You succeeded. You always do, even when you don't believe it. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crack and the wind move through the pines. What happens now? Gideon asked. Now that there's no judge hanging over us, no legal pressure, what do we do? We keep going, keep building, keep being a family. Clara looked up at him. Unless you want something different? I want exactly this, every day for the rest of my life. Then that's what we'll do. The years that followed weren't easy. Nothing worth having ever is. There were hard winters when food ran short. There were arguments and misunderstandings, and moments when they all wanted to give up. Emma struggled in school when they finally sent her at age 10. Caleb went through a rebellious phase at 14 that tested everyone's patience. But they weathered it together. The cabin grew as the family's needs changed. Gideon added a second floor, then a proper kitchen. Clara's garden expanded until they were selling vegetables in town. The children grew taller, stronger, more confident. Word of the family spread beyond Red Hollow. People talked about the mountain man who'd saved 2 orphans and the widow who'd married him to keep them together. The story grew in the telling, became something between truth and legend. But the core of it remained accurate. 2 broken people had chosen kindness over isolation, had built something real from desperation and determination. When Emma was 16 and Caleb 18, both tall and capable and ready to make their own ways in the world, Clara asked Gideon if he had any regrets. They were sitting on the porch they'd built 5 years earlier, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Regrets about what?" he asked.
All of it. The marriage, the children, giving up your solitude. Gideon thought about the man he'd been before that February storm, alone, isolated, slowly turning into something less than human. Then he thought about the man he was now, a husband, a father, someone who belonged. "None," he said. "Not a single one." Clara smiled and took his hand. "Were you kind today?" It was still their ritual, even after all these years. Every night, the same question. "I tried," Gideon said.
"You succeeded." Inside the cabin, they could hear Emma and Caleb arguing about something trivial, whose turn it was to do dishes, probably. The sound was familiar, comfortable, home. "You know what I learned from all this?" Clara said. "What?" "That family isn't about blood or legal documents or doing everything perfectly. It's about showing up. Every day, even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when you want to quit. It's about trying to be kind even when the world isn't kind back." Gideon squeezed her hand. "Sounds about right. And it's about having the courage to build something when everyone says it's impossible. To look at 2 scared children in a wagon and decide they matter. To marry a stranger because it's the right thing to do. To keep choosing each other day after day after day. We did get lucky, though," Gideon pointed out. "It could have gone differently. Luck had nothing to do with it. We made this happen. We chose it, fought for it, built it with our own hands." She was right, of course. Clara usually was. They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged. 2 people who'd found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances and built something that lasted. Red Hollow never forgot them. The story of the mountain man and the widow became the kind of tale parents told their children. Not about romance or grand gestures, but about ordinary courage. About kindness in the face of mockery. About building families from broken pieces. Years later, when people asked Caleb and Emma what it was like growing up with Gideon and Clara Rourke, they gave the same answer. They weren't perfect, they made mistakes, they struggled, but they never stopped trying, and that was enough. Because in the end, that's all any family is. Imperfect people choosing to keep trying, choosing kindness over cruelty, choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, choosing to build something that matters. Gideon Rourke lived to be 73. Clara made it to 76. They died within months of each other, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the cabin that had grown to accommodate them all. At Gideon's funeral, Caleb told the story of how they'd met. The blizzard, the frozen wagon, the desperate ride to safety. He told it without embellishment, letting the simple facts speak for themselves. "My father wasn't a hero," Caleb said. "He was just a man who saw children in trouble and decided to help. But that's the thing about heroes. They're not special. They're just ordinary people who choose to act when everyone else chooses to look away." Emma spoke at Clara's funeral. She talked about kindness, about a woman who'd buried her own family and then had the courage to build another one. About how Clara had asked one question in a saloon full of mockery and changed 4 lives forever.
"Mama taught me that love isn't a feeling," Emma said. "It's a choice you make every single day." "Were you kind today?" That's what she asked Papa every night. And every night he said the same thing: "I tried." That's all any of us can do. Try to be kind, try to show up, try to be worthy of the people who love us. The cabin still stands, though the family has long since moved on. Sometimes travelers stop there, seeking shelter from storms or just curious about the place where the legend began.
If you listen carefully in the quiet moments, you can almost hear them, the laughter of children learning to feel safe again, the quiet conversations of two people learning to love, the everyday sounds of a family being built from scratch. And if you're very fortunate, if you find yourself alone and afraid and certain that nobody cares whether you live or die, you might remember this story. You might remember that families can be built from desperation and determination, that strangers can become home, that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged not in perfect circumstances, but in the courage to try. Because that's what Gideon and Clara proved, that it doesn't take perfection to build something worth keeping. It just takes showing up, trying to be kind, choosing each other day after day after day. And sometimes, when the world is cruel and cold and you're certain you can't go on, that's enough. It has to be. It was enough for them.